It's great to be back. Those of you who were able to see yesterday's event, we kind of went into detail a lot about the Tubing Bulak site, and I'll mention some of that and talk a bit about that project just towards the tail end. But given the time allotment of roughly 30 minutes, which is hard for me to keep under 30 minutes anything, I'm going to skate through that part at the end a bit more rapidly and try to focus on something a little bit different, to try to take on the task of the conference theme, which is what are the macro-historical icons? What are the things that we can actually understand about Eurasia at a broader, long-term scale that can bring us to questions almost in any time period? And to answer that question, I thought about it in different ways. I was actually reminded of this photograph, which I took in 2001 at the foothills of Khan Tengri in Kazakhstan. In fact, this is the last turnoff. That's the way to the north. If you turn to the south, off the other road, it takes you to the highest peak in Kazakhstan and arguably in the Tian Shan Mountains, over 7,000 meters. And what I like about this photo, which was what you can't see, and then it's just off the frame. There's another less well framed out photograph of a modern yurt sitting in this riparian delta fan, which is actually relatively high elevation, but where there are herdsmen, a herder's family living in a small yurt. When we visited them, which is typically what one does, we found out that they had a completely different economy than any other family living in a yurt that I've ever met. They were mostly fishermen. So they did have sheep and goats and that kind of things, but they spent an enormous time fishing because why not? They're living in this wonderful river valley. They were a unique family though. So I'd never met really another significant fisher family like in this context. And so as I was thinking about what I want to talk about today, I was reminded of these sort of unique expressions of the regional trends and the regional norms that we expect for parts of the world like Eurasia, and how this fits into the arc of the archaeological record over millennia. What can we do to think about Eurasia at the broad scale? We should start with environment. I think that many of us who work in landscape archaeology think first and foremost from an ecological or environmental perspective. And that is to say, what does the climate and ecological resources, how do they play into these long traditions, whether it be subsistence economy strategies, trade exchange, etc., all of these different things. Which brings us to the topic of climate change and archaeology in and of itself. And there's been lots of debate, and I've been wading into this debate. It's another lecture in a certain sense. But the take-home message here is that most archaeologists today envision their role in modern debates about climate change as being able to provide some historical or deep time perspective about how humans adapt to or change their strategies according to climate, right, and climate change. It's a very optimistic and wonderful message. It brings archaeology front and center into contemporary debates. No problem. But there's some sticking points. And I cite these recent articles here, which I think go back a decade or more, but still, even more recently here in 2021, contend that there is an archaeology of climate change or archaeology of environment that brings us into this sort of contemporary dialogue relevant to the contemporary world. Others have been a bit more critical of this engagement. Paul Lane, a colleague of ours, kind of questions the validity of this at a very pragmatic level. It's like, sure, we aspire to be able to have that engagement around climate change debates and the question of how humans adapt to the environment, but the truth of the matter is that we oftentimes have very limited tools, or let's say, we're kind of eyeballing the relationship. And so all of this wonderful, framework, this organization between the actual climatic archives and the archaeological or historical archives is suffered by this lack, or let's say discordance between data scales and interoperability. So in other words, if I were to say to you, within this 15 centimeter strata of archaeological remains, how does that, which represents 300 years, radiocarbon years, how does that reflect the weather? How does that reflect climate? So you see a bump in a climate record, or you see a rise in a certain urban setting, and you say, these people were adapting to the environment. Well, my question for you, are you today adapting to your environment? How? Because that's what's living in the archaeological record. And the environmental record is an accumulation that we see as kind of an artifact post-archaeology. Right? We do something, and then 100 years later we say, oh look, here's a 100-year record of how things have changed. But today, we're actually not adapting to the environment. Now, I might ride my bike today rather than drive, but I'm not changing my fundamental life ways. Our fundamental life ways still exist on this long arc, which is a very different framework. So this has been something that's really occupied my thought process and brings me to this wonderful quote by Graham Barker. And I think it will tie into some of the other lectures that we're going to hear today. I'm thinking of Rob and other people. And that is that, you know, as we think about the development of agricultural economies, the rise of pastoralist economies, certain kinds of trade networks, urbanism, etc., these revolutions, these Childian revolutions that we've heard about for many, many decades in the archaeological literature. What I think that this quote emphasizes is that people then, as now, had choices and made decisions that then reflect the arc of history that we see, right? So those contingencies about whether you're going to be a fisher person or a herder person, depending on where you put yours, may or may not be visible in the archaeological record, given kind of the resolutions that we have. And those are the important decisions that ultimately are what these adaptive strategies and resiliencies are about. Which brings us to this Venn diagram about human choice. And I've been playing with this diagram. I may have presented it to some of you before. It's published now recently in a volume out of Germany on mobilities, but it specifically tries to summarize a complex array of factors that go into what we consider to be human choice. So when you make a choice today, whether you're going to eat Wagyu beef or a soy burger, what are you considering as part of your decision-making process? One, what do you like to eat? Tradition and identity. Right? Do you like it spicy or not spicy? Because if you like it spicy, you're going to put some spices on it. And those spices are going to trigger various components of the Venn diagram. Because now you need to trade for those spices to get those into your food. Okay. These are individual choices, family level choices, right? Regional level choices. And they scale all the way up to what we call cultural choices. Right? So this complex Venn diagram is sort of an array, a three-dimensional array of factors that we all go through as humans anthropologically, but which archaeologically we very rarely can see the full picture of. So we might say, oh, the environment shapes mobility. I've made that argument. Right? The ecology is what makes people move places. But it's also the fact that they want to gather certain resources. It's also the fact that they want to move to a new territory to express their political power away from people who maybe have been repressing them or holding them down. It may also simply be because they have a new trade line, or it may simply also be because they don't like their brother-in-law. And I've actually had all of those ethnographic cases presented to me by herdsmen who I've worked with. And I said, why aren't you putting our yurts here? It's a beautiful pasture, there's tons of grass. Yeah, but those are the people who've come from another place. This was the context of when Kazakhstan was offering land grants to Chinese-born Kazakhs, who were then given land grants in Kazakhstan. The local herdsmen, there was a bit of schism there. They said, okay, those are the folks from Xinjiang. We don't want to live near that. So sort of a certain degree of exclusionism, right? So they moved on. They moved further. They changed their patterns. And what we see is then our explanations of how climate change is affecting the world, or how everything, all these long arc questions, it actually comes down to a much more messy set of considerations. So in the context of this Venn diagram, I started to participate with an interdisciplinary group of climate modelers, volcanologists who look at the natural forcings of the climate, historians, climate historians, and regional experts, people like Nicola de Cosmo, Ulf Bunchen, whose name is on everyone's paper because he gives the dead year chronology that's behind the radiocarbon curve. And these folks pulled together an interdisciplinary crowd from around the world to deal with this issue of mismatch. How do we actually communicate when what I'm talking about is people deciding whether they should put spice on their food, and what he's talking about is the global climatic reaction to a volcano or some other forcing that's going to make the temperature 1 degree colder. How do you reconcile that information? Because I can measure the planet's temperature change as 1 degree colder or warmer in any given year. But I don't know how that affects someone's choices to put spices on their food. And ultimately, this is kind of where we're at, right? Is this complex social history that is reflected in this distilled archaeology, which is fairly incomplete. So we're talking in these very grandiose terms that we're going to, shape the new world of environmental change and inform the IPCC about how people did all these things in the past. And of course, Central Asia plays a key role in this. But in actuality, it's kind of bullshit, right? Not that the climate changed or that people react to it, but that we can actually tell the difference. And I'm being quite provocative here because how do you know how much it changed? So what we decided to come up with, we used that same Venn diagram as a platform, and we came up with a thing called a dahliagram. And you'll understand what I mean by why it becomes a dahliagram in a minute. The dahliagram is an analog conceptualization tool. And what it allows you to do is take all those factors, politics, connectivity, identity, subsistence, and we kind of tried to get a wide enough ontology of things that were economic, cultural, geographic, and governmental or political. And then you rank them according to your best knowledge and research. So you get an interdisciplinary team, you get a room together, and you say, okay, let's work on this problem. And you get a we do this now, we work in teams, right? So we say, okay, well, let's go back to the Yamnaya migration to the Altai. Some people in the room are familiar with this. I'll talk a bit more about it genetically in a minute, if I have time. What drove this population living in the North Caucasus, 3000 BC, to pick up and move? Like, there's an example, there's a real archaeological evidence here that a batch of these individuals packed up and moved 1,000 kilometers to the east. What were they thinking? Like, who does that in 3000 BC? So you start looking through the evidence, and a lot of arguments have been made about climate. Climate must be because the steppe dried up. They've been living in a dried up steppe for already 500 years almost. The dried up steppe was not a shock to them. In fact, they were well adapted to the dried up steppe. Their entire economy was oriented around the ability to adapt to the dried up steppe. So from my reading of the climate record, what we actually know about the climate changes, the temperatures and precipitations, and what would have actually happened in terms of primary productivity in the grasslands, it's a 1. What's it, a Starbucks? That's a grande, right? Or what's the small one? Tall. You have tall, grande, venti. 1, 2, 3. Big, little, small. Small, medium, large. Right? So I think the climate's a small at 3000 BC. I think resource availability, though, is a slightly different question. What they needed wasn't just a climatic reaction, but in fact, they were definitely moving according to some resources. If they were pastoralists, they needed to feed those animals. And that's an environmental question, it's a resource question more than it is a climate question. Right? So resource availability, I'll give that a 2. And of course, this leads to subsistence strategy. Now you can shape a subsistence strategy, and I think that this was a major factor. There were innovators in their subsistence strategy. And I think the main factors that really drove them to pick up and go had to do with their relationships, their identity relationships within their communities. Now, you might say, Michael, okay, great, I see your picture. How do you prove it? Well, the proof is simply the research, right? So you go into the citations and you load up your citations and say, this is what I believe, and there's my argument. That takes a long time, and each of us can do that. Anyone's welcome to take the Yamnaya case study, rewrite it, and do a new dahliagram. But the neat thing about the dahliagram is I can compare it to mine, and you can immediately see what's different. And here's how I know that. Look at the Bronze Age. Now, I should also mention, go back for a second. The Yamnaya migration was short-lived and very far. It's a temporal blip in the prehistoric radar in terms of like time, but it's quite long distance. So scale, you look at the Bronze Age, the 2nd millennium BC. Now we're talking about perpetual movement, mobility, different kind of mobility. Totally okay to also have on the same chart. Because we change the scales, right? We adjust our scale of conversation. But we say if we look at now mobility in the 2nd millennium BC, the drivers are really different from what the archaeology actually tells us. A lot of social connectivity, tons of trade and exchange in terms of lots of different resources. Definitely tons of new innovations, horse riding, chariots, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of brand new technologies really influencing mobility in this context. Of course, technology goes with that innovation. New forms of production and consumption, the emergence of really tin bronze, right, as a new productive endeavor, not just in terms of materials, but actually in terms of technology. Knowledge and know-how changes a bit. And I say less than the previous one because to make a long-distance migration to a new territory, you had to know where you're going. And you have to sort of wander off into the steppe for a while until you find someplace. Whereas the smaller the restriction in knowledge that you see by the Bronze Age means that those areas are already mapped. So it doesn't require an influence of knowledge, it's just that knowledge exists. So it's just understand how the thing changes. I think the identity column goes down in the Bronze Age because it's more heterogeneous. So it's difficult in a heterogeneous environment to be so polarized. When you have a lot of different people around you, you have to acquiesce and assimilate. So the identity factor backs down a bit, because in the Bronze Age you have greater diversity. Subsistence strategy remains, the other things remain. The climate may actually have played climate as a macro category may have played a larger role in this case. We have 4-2K events, we've got droughts, we have things that are documented in the record that really pivot in these early centuries of the second millennium BC. Now, you don't have to agree with the flower here in its specifics. In fact, that's the idea. I want to provoke you to come up with a different one, because I think it's really neat. But if we move to the Gökturks, now we're in the 6th century, the factors are really different, based on what we know. Part of that is because of the archive, what we actually know about the Gökturks. We know much more historically about them. So we have more evidence about their politics and power structure. And we don't know 100% what the politics of the Yamnaya were. So we kind of have to give it a low number because there's sort of a gap in knowledge. But by the Gökturks, we know that there's an important factor there. We know there's political motivations, the rise of empires, etc. Other factors maybe are different. And of course, if we use the final one is the Mongol imperial expansion, a different form of mobility, but yet again, a different picture. So this is a composite 4,000-year tool to understand the shifting choices and motivations behind this question of human mobility. One particular question in the middle, like movement and mobility, of different forms and different kinds. But it's a tool that in a very rapid form, in 15 minutes, whether you like my explanation or not, and whether the science is behind it or not is not really important, I can walk you through this very easily and explain, I could probably explain this to a 5th grader, right? It's very clear, very obvious, and very easy to deploy and to modify. If Will publishes a paper tomorrow on something in particular that affects my choices, I just go back to my diagram and erase the 2 and I give it a 3. I just upgrade to a Venti. Okay. These are the diagrams. And I'm going to keep them in the back of your mind. I'm going to skate now very rapidly through some archaeological stuff, and I won't be able to hit it all. I'm way over time. But I think it pays now to see some of the work behind it. And just to give you a quick sense about how these things play out, this is the team that built the Eurasian diagram, and this is the team that built the Horn of Africa diagram. Different time periods, different windows of time, but you see that when you do regional comparisons, you see really different evolutions to the same planet, right? The same climate changes, the same curves that would have affected macro-regional climate versus local climate. So what can we say now about Eurasia? I'm going to now be quite quick. I want to take you through 3 vignettes, which touch on some of these themes. I'm going to go quick. Okay, so the 3 vignettes that I want to talk about. One is the work of my students and former students at the site of Koken, which is an open step environment site, really interesting, novel site, which you may not have heard about yet, but I encourage you to reach out to those archaeologists, and I'll show you who they are in a second. The second is a well-known set of prehistoric sites where myself and Rob and a number of others in this room have worked and are familiar, and that is in the Jungar Mountains. And the third, of course, is the Tsugunbuak Tashbuak complex, a medieval complex, which I spoke of briefly. I'm going to skate through these things relatively quickly, but with just enough sensitivity. Koken. The cool thing about Koken is its environment. It's not a mountain environment, it's just at the outer fringe, so it's considered open steppe. If you look at this environment, it's largely inhospitable to pastoralists. And years ago, I think the publication for Rob came with 2013, your micro niche paper.
Oh yeah, 2013.
2013, Rob and I was included on that smart paper. Rob made a comment about the mosaic nature of ecological niches and how the Eurasian steppe and the Eurasian environment in general shouldn't be summarized as this highway or whatever. And we've really taken it as this broadly similar space. In fact, it's not. This is the open steppe in the summertime. And what you can see is you can't live everywhere. And you can't feed sheep everywhere. You can only feed them in that little tiny green pocket where water is pouring out of the mountainside. And so there's actually a very mosaic landscape of where you can live and what you can do, which affects all those other things. So from an environmental perspective, it's an interesting angle on things like mobility, technology choice, etc. The cool thing about Koken And again, this is a project led by Paula Giummani, my former PhD students, who now has students who are now my PhD students. So it's sort of I'm an academic grandfather. And her student, Yildiz, who's from Kazakhstan, the previous slide had her name, Yildiz Tashmanbetova. She's a PhD student at WashU, but a former master's student of Paula, so she has worked at the site for a number of years. The neat thing about the site is its age. It's this deep time palimpsest, which takes you from the late Paleolithic through the Bronze Age and even into an ethnographic context, which gives us some window to compare significantly different climate eras, epochs, with different kinds of choices that were being made. The Neolithic and Paleolithic, right now, we understand, well, let me just take you through. We have mobile hunting in the early phase, emergent or incipient pastoralism in the early Bronze Age, full-blown mobile pastoralism in the later Bronze Age, and then, of course, with no farming in the later phase. Now, the mobile pastoralism with farming, I'm pretty sure that's only right now. Actually, I may be wrong, to be honest. I can't remember what the data says. I think we have millet evidence. It's a Miliasin paper that's coming out. Anyway, we'll leave the farming part of it out of it for a minute, but nevertheless, you see this shift in the economy, which is interesting in and of itself. From the early time period, one of the big projects we're working on now is to understand the role of certain animals and their ecosystems. So saiga, this like strange-faced antelope of the Eurasian steppe, they're very cute, if not a bit Star Warsy. They have these incredibly detailed migration patterns, and this is just a broad summary of them by a source, 10-year-old source. But you look at the way these saiga actually move, and this is a more recent study. It's very networked, very complex, very regionally unique. And of course, that's the mobility patterns that we're thinking of as being those resource availability bubbles of petals on the diagram. So when we think of this time period, we're looking at the environment, looking at climate, we're looking at resource availability and subsistence strategy as major drivers of mobility, major drivers of technology, right? So we know nothing about politics, we know nothing about exchange in those early times. When we translate that to the ethnographic record, or just like jump now to an ethnographic time period, and I'm looking to see if our colleague who studies contemporary Kazakhs is here. I don't think so. No, not yet. This is a map she would like. This is a very famous map from the 1970s of Kazakh migration patterns. And what you notice is that no one moves east or west in the Eurasian steppe. Neither the saiga or the people. Everyone moves north and south. So all the maps you see with people moving east and west across the Eurasian steppe would be counter-ecological. That would have to be specifically driven by something other than the natural way you exploit that region as a pastoralist or even a hunter. You wouldn't move east to west. Now you might bend, you could go up into the side, right? But you're not really moving east to west. The corridor region, the mountain corridor, is a slightly different environment. You have elevation there to help shape. I've talked about this a lot, and that's a different mobility pattern altogether. And in fact, what we see, not surprisingly, is that east to west, north to south, the basic economic structure of Eurasia at the time of the early Bronze Age is really quite different, right? So if you look at early Bronze Age in the Western steppe versus early Bronze Age in the Altai, and this is now for those of us who are trying to understand the relationships between certain communities and what they do, what choices they make, in fact, those environments are really, really different. And so the corridor ties together. We've got wheat and full-blown pastoralism as well already by almost 5,000 BC. Sorry, 5,000 BP, 3,000 BC. Farming doesn't cross that line for quite some time, right? So almost into the Iron Age in some cases. And so we really do see a differentiation along these ecological lines. So if we put into the middle of the diagram, subsistence economy, and so what effect is this subsistence economy, we could build out big aspects of what the environment was doing, how the ecology was shaping that. We could do less of right now is understand how identity, politics, and these kinds of things. We didn't even talk about exchange, right? I'm not going to that now. But we can't talk about some of the other elements of the diagram. We now know this paper and this work very well. It's from some of the most, I think, in a lot of ways, and I say this proudly and also congratulatorily to Rob and others involved, this effort to understand how complex the economies were of the Eurasian steppe and how that was the result of some kind of interaction and transmission process really has, I think in the last 20 years, transformed entirely the way we understand the Bronze Age of this area. Yet, it still is housed largely within that ecological, environmental subsistence realm and a bit in the connectivity realm. We haven't been able to access how these plants and animals really shaped ideologies. We touched on it a little bit, that the first publication on the seeds was kind of about ideology, but it was pretty loosely argued. So, you know, it's, again, like an amazing set of conclusions about the early formations of the proto-Silk Road, whatever you want to call it. But in fact, still quite lacking in some aspects of that multi-arrayed set of choices that we're talking about. Luckily, we have other forms of evidence that bring us through that conversation. This is the large genetic study published in 2019 in Science, which not only verifies and concludes, you know, that clear and obvious spark of migration of the Yamnaya population at 3000 BC. You see, where's my pointer here? I don't know. Yamnaya to Afanasyevo, very like one-to-one match genetically. But you see also this huge clinal distribution of red to green. That's Iranian-based genetics making their way into the Eurasian steppe at the exact time, if not sooner, than that migration. Okay? And of course, you see those connections at Botai. Right? So there, in fact, are genetic sources from the south making their way up the corridor, bringing those economic trends that might be related now to some of the aspects of that diagram. Who you mate with, who you marry, who you ally with. Like, those take alliances. You don't just sort of like have kids. Right? You have to, there's some social process behind that, right? Either good, bad, or otherwise. Thank you for the bells. Reminding me to keep moving. This is the early Bronze Age picture. And these are the sites we're going to talk about. So we actually have, you know, our sites, the ones we've excavated richly in archaeology, we're in this genetic study. Here's the site of Dali, the one I just circled. And you say, okay, this is one of the sites that is part of that inner Asian mountain corridor spread of crops and animals. We have the genetics for it in the early Bronze Age. But we also have a really clear picture of their long-standing economic system, which is a very different one from their neighbors. So here's three sites, right? Dali Taspas, which is kind of clumped, because they're 1 kilometer apart. Bigash, right? Nearby sites, but with really different practices. Both part of the same overarching system of planting crops, keeping animals. But some of them are using more or less fodder. Some of them are more mobile. Some of them might be doing some fishing. Some of them might be doing more trading. Personal choices. So if I made a diagram for the Inner-Asian Mountain Corridor, I probably would have to differentiate exactly which site data I was talking about and what resolution I wanted to summarize that data. Right? So it would look different than the overarching Bronze Age one that I showed you earlier. And of course, we know that each of the sites along the corridor, this is kind of just like a smattering of them from various publications, and people have now done a lot of work along them. So sites like Chap and Zhukov and the work that Rob's done in Tongtian Cave and elsewhere show a really wide range of selections. Some ecologically driven, some socially driven, I think. Some just based on what other kinds of technologies and techniques you have. Can you actually irrigate the field or not irrigate the field? Do you need to irrigate the field? What's the rainfall? The rainfall down here versus the rainfall up there is different. Right? So the environment isn't a static thing. It's like the environment, if the environment is changing, and I live in Manitoba, versus the environment is changing and you live in Florida, that's a different choice, right? But we get the record that says the climate changed. We get the bubble, the drop, and the wiggle in the line. Sorry. Okay. And we see that in the isotopes. Throughout the corridor itself, we see trends, but we also see different kinds of choices depending on elevation, different choices depending on latitude. So the Chinese have done some really interesting work here, teasing apart this isotopic record along the mountain corridor, many, many sites going into the deserts and other regions, and really illustrating that it's not just one thing, right? So there's a lot of different adaptations that are part of that macro-historical picture, which we call the Inner-Asian Mountain Corridor, or the steppe. But in fact, you can tunnel in, and it's really quite diverse. And of course, here's our comparative climate chart. So this is the best we've got, something like this, right? You've got the window of time in red here to this one here. While it, At Koken, you've got no farming and only emerging pastoralism, whereas in the mountain corridor, you've got early farming and pastoralism. Same line, same broad regional climate, just different adaptations, different choices. When we get to the second millennium BC, this starts to express itself in even more tangible ways. Genetically, we can see those choices playing out not only in terms of people's movement, but in terms of who they are interacting with, who they want to interact with. And I want to point out a couple of key sites here. The green area is considered the BMAC. Right? This is Turkmenistan, southern and central Asia, oasis cultures, desert farmers, urbanized societies. Right? A huge portion, 80% of their genetics, is related to an Iranian Neolithic core. That's what that green is. Okay? And you can see that distributed throughout the second millennium in various percentages around. The bulk of their second millennium BC genetics is an admixture of Western Eurasian genetics that comes in as a third wave of political and social admixture. Remember, they're already pastoralists, so this isn't an economic expansion, it's more of a social one. But pay attention to the diversity. Dali and Tasbas, how far apart they are in terms of the genetic composition. Those two sites within a span of 100 years or so are very different genetic people. Those sites are 1 kilometer apart from each other. Okay. So if you actually go geographically across this map, Aidirjal is closer to the BMAC vis-a-vis the mountain corridor. Tasbas and Dali are in fact probably the next. Actually no, Dashti Kozi is the next closest. That's in Tajikistan. So that should actually be closer to the BMAC than Aidirjal. So this isn't a geographic mapping. This is percent, if you're just looking at the pure genetic code, there are people further away from some core contributing source in terms of their actual genetic record than they should be. So migration and such isn't happening in this kind of linear fashion, it's happening in a quite disarrayed fashion. And of course we see some societies who are heavily engaged in trade and exchange, like those in Shaohe in Central America, completely different cultural identity, completely different burial tradition, but they have the same wheat that we have at Bigash, same morphotypes, right? Compact, bounded wheats. So those wheats are making their way into their lifeway, as well as the basketry and textiles, which we also have at Bigash in the corridor. So from a cultural perspective, these folks are very mountain corridor. But they live in the desert, they have a completely different identity, and they don't mix with anybody. Genetically, they don't want anything to do with you. They are a remnant population from the Paleolithic, almost, in terms of their genetic isolation. Tons of connectivity, but don't try to marry in. Okay? So you've got this really unique set of choices of communities that do want in, don't want in. They want in for trade, but they don't want in for this or that. So we can't paint it with a common brush. The conclusion, which I'm delighted to see, as it promotes my ideas, this finding is consistent with earlier arguments that the IMAC Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor was a geographic corridor and vector for regional cultural interaction that connected disparate populations from the 4th and 2nd millennium, but they were genetically isolated and autochthonous. So, it's not all in one. It doesn't just come as a wave, right? I think I've made my point, but let me just quickly run you through the tin bronze stuff. The corridor also influences things like consumption and ideology around certain technologies. This is why I put a big blob on the technology ring. These are all burials of the same stylistic approach. They all contain the same syntax: knives, earrings, mirrors, ceramics, all placed in the same way. This is a syntax of how you bury a body in Asia, in Eurasia at this time. The metals are important to that. Here's one of those samples. At Dali, we have the production sequence of those metals, and with the help of Milinda Radivovic at UCL, who has a big project now in Eurasian bronzes, she's analyzed the tin isotopes for the sites, Dali, Tasbas, and Bigash. And you can see them there in the dots, red, green, and yellow. Red, green, I guess just red and green this one. What you see is something very interesting. According to the isotopes, the closest ore sources, the northeastern Kazakhstan ore sources, are not being used. In fact, those sites are importing their ores from very far to the south, from Uzbekistan. So why? Why would they bring copper in from thousands of miles away when there's local copper sources? My thoughts exactly. And here's what it shows. In the early Bronze Age, these are the networks of exchange that we can see based on on lead isotopes. So this is the actual chemistry makeup of the bronzes themselves. By the Middle Bronze Age, Bigash and Dali, which are no more than 50 kilometers apart in the same ecosystem, slightly different mobility patterns, are actually participating in two foundationally different trade networks. And by the Late Bronze Age, the whole thing gets mixed up in a different way. So time and time again, the choices are being made different. In spite of them having very similar economies, having similar animal percentages, similar plants, being part of that trade network is somewhat overlapping. But for tin and bronze, it's a different choice. Again, different strokes from different folks. And of course, the impact of those sources and ores is not only local. This is a paper we published in Science Advances a few years ago, showing the sources of tin that you need to make tin bronze being traded all the way to the Mediterranean in the Late Bronze Age. And I think that just a map like that is probably not a bad place to stop, because I just want to end that. This will take us into the urbanism example, but I want to just end to my final slide, so I'm just going to go ahead and take us to the end there. If we look, for example, at the medieval period, at all the things that were occurring, new mountain urbanism, kinds of trade networks that we see as the Silk Road, climate, meh, kind of not such a big deal. We're in a perfectly nice, smooth era of happy, warm climates in the medieval period. But when we zoom in and we see, okay, what are people doing locally to produce metals, to to utilize the forests and things that they can't go back. To utilize the forests that they're using for smelting, it's having an impact on all of these changes that we then associate with the macrohistory of Eurasia. So if I were to make a diagram for highland urbanism, which I would have shown you if I had 45 more minutes, it's again a different diagram, but one that we can begin to stitch together. And because I couldn't show you the data, that's my point. You can still get my argument in 2 seconds. This tool is extremely useful because it's an analog tool. You don't need to know R or a statistical package. It's just our qualitative assessment of vast amounts of knowledge through interdisciplinary and collaborative research to make a hypothesis and say, I think that this is what's driving urbanism. And I can communicate that much more easily, almost in 5 minutes, than a whole 10 years of work to try to demonstrate each of those things. Now, you have to do the work anyway, but at least you have the tool now to use it to demonstrate. So when you think about places like Eurasia, there's a panoply of flowers that allow us to illustrate this grand history. And it takes this kind of interdisciplinarity and this kind of cross-fertilization of different archives, different sources, different approaches to come up with ways to really conceptualize thousands and thousands of years of human history. Thank you.
So I love the dahlia flowers. My other question is, what do you mean by knowledge of it?
Yeah, so for me, mobility to me is something that requires knowledge. And so knowledge is a couple of different domains, right? It could be the domain of botany, it could be the domain of simple geography, like, do you know where you're going? And one of my newest proposals, which I'm really leaning into and trying to figure out ways to prove it, which is hard, archaeologically, but maybe easier in the medieval period or historical period, is that I no longer believe that migrations, even in deep prehistoric time, were blind. I think that early human populations had far greater connoitering of their geographies, and so, we assume that these early populations are just kind of roaming around, looking for resources, these folks understood exactly where they were going, thousands of kilometers away. They knew there was a mountain range there. The Altai has been in play as a refugia for millennia, since the Paleolithic. Those communities have been interacting, chasing Saiga for thousands of years. They bump into each other, they talk, they marry, they do things. And we see that in the genetics now. We see those expressions of connection. With those genetics, we also see information flow. So when I say knowledge, if you need to have a big circle or a small circle, it's what kind of new knowledge do you have to make that thing happen? So for urbanism, you do need to have some specialized knowledge if you're not already building cities. So for the highland urban sites, they need to invest in learning how to do it. So that would have gotten a bigger pedal than, say, a long-standing urban society for whom urbanism was second nature. So that's kind of how I'm playing with it. But the good thing with the diagram is that you're not wedded to those categories. If something's important to your questioning, you can say, I'm going to replace that one with something else. This is kind of one ontology of sources of choices, but it doesn't have to be. It's not strict in that way, paradigmatically.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
How large are the samples of your genetic analysis?
This one was quite large. This study that I showed you was the largest ever conducted. Upwards of 700 samples. So it was a huge study. This was one of my big critiques of earlier studies was they had 2 or 3 samples to summarize the entirety of Eurasia. And so the problem, of course, is that it's hard to get 500 new samples. So we spent 3 years traveling Central Asia, talking to colleagues, building partnerships, making sure we actually signed ethical agreements with every one of our partners to make sure that when they gave us samples that they were going to be part of the study and they understood what was going on. And so I ran a lot of interference to make sure that we weren't just like vacuuming up samples to do genetic studies. But it did turn out to be a really mega, picture of the nuances. And that sample size is what enabled us to see all that nuance. Because without those numbers, you wouldn't see the differentiation.
And when do tributary relationships start so that they actually shift human beings around, slaves, women, whatever, because that makes a big difference?
We know of it for sure by the Xiongnu period. And I would argue that, well, even in the Bronze Age, all of the major sites where we had like very large sample sets, so upwards of 25 or 30 individuals, all of those sites showed what we would call outliers. So in the BMAC sample, let's say there's like 50 or 60 sample of individuals in that sample, 20 of them are genetically foreign. In other words, they're not in the primary statistical cluster. And they cluster from all over Eurasia. So those cosmopolitan cities had people from literally all over Eurasia. You say, okay, that's fine, they're cities. But you could go to Sintashta or you go to areas of the north, in the steppe area, and it's the same picture in reverse. So people from the south are up there doing the same thing. So this question of like targeted mobility within a broader socio-political system was taking place as early as 2000 BC. No question. I would say that with strong confidence. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a great talk. Do you have diagram go beyond the Mongol expansion?
I haven't made one, but we can do it. Yeah. If you want to make one, let's do it.
I think they will be very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, they're easy to make as long as you can make one that's really speculative. To make one that's really got good data behind it, of course, takes time and partnership. But they're available. We have ones that look at Colombian transatlantic mobility. We have ones that look at the younger Dryas out of Africa. I mean, we really tried to use them provocatively for lots of different phases of human mobility to see how much utility does the diagram have. And in all cases, all of the reviewers, at least, and people who commented on the paper, have all suggested that this simple tool really does allow you to kind of communicate something quite robust in a way that is super apprehensible, or you can apprehend it quite readily. So we could do one for any time period.
Hi, Michael. I haven't studied your diagram article too closely, but it's intriguing. I guess I just wanted to get some clarity. Is the idea that we're thinking about cultural and social and economic change from multiple factors, and the diagram's goal is to understand the push and pull factors, and then measure their intensity?
Their relative impact.
Their impact and importance.
Because if someone said to me, exactly that. So if someone said to you, the climate changed a lot during that time period, but so did the politics. There's political upheaval, and there was some climatic factors. Which one's affecting resiliency and sustainability more? Well, I can show you climatically that it's going to move 3.7 degrees and this much change in precipitation, and it's going to change the production of the field by 20%. Okay, that's all numerical. It's very nice data. That's strong evidence for a big impact. Data.
So how do you normalize across data to arrive at the three levels of intensity? And then also, what about controlling for when you have a lot of good evidence on one issue and the quality of the evidence for another push-pull factor is not as robust? How do you control for that?
So first question first, how do we normalize? Because it's a qualitative ranking, 1, 2, or 3, you do each one individually. So you say, okay, let's think only about the environmental stuff. Is it a big impact, a medium impact, or a small impact? And we all kind of sit around, we debate, we argue, and everyone kind of agrees, you know, if we can't agree, then it's medium, right? If you can really agree that it's small or large, fine. You bring the data to the table and say, I'm going to pound into that theme, and the climate scientists are like, no. You know, the grasslands totally changed, it was the younger dryas, and snow was everywhere, it was a huge impact. Okay.
So something there like, so climate, so you're thinking about climate change and its impact across regions. So is
no, it's within a region. You set the boundary, right? So you say, okay,
it's not like we're thinking about its impact on the Horn of Africa, and then we're thinking about, and then we're trying to normalize that way.
No. You're within it. You set your spatial and temporal boundary. So you say, I'm looking at the Horn of Africa, or I'm looking at all of the continent of Eurasia. Of course, it becomes less effective when you get up to certain kinds of scales, right? Okay. But you target that topic and you research it, you assess and say, okay, I'm going to call that a 3. It's a big impact in younger dryas. And by all accounts, the younger dryas have a big environmental impact. Okay, now let's look at politics. What was the politics of 11th, 12th century developments in the Levant? Abu Huraira or something, 10,000 BP. I don't know. Like, what do we know about the politics of Abu Huraira? Like, nothing. So there's your point about question mark. You give it a 0 because I don't have any data. So if you see a 0, then it's basically like no data. We don't know.
So the absence of
something,
a low median is an absence of data.
It's a weakness, of course, because ideally, but it also shows you where you need to do work. So if everything's coming up in ecology and environment, like, maybe we should invest in some other research. Yeah.
Thanks.
Anyway, I'd be happy to walk anybody through diagrams. It's a neat little thought experiment, and it works really well in an interdisciplinary context. And yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you all. Thanks for that great talk, Michael. And I'm happy to be with such a cool interdisciplinary group of people. Today I'm going to talk with you all about horses, connectivity, and Eurasia. And usually when I do something like this, it makes people a little bit angry. So if you're asked just that you stomach your disgust until the Q&A section, because I've spent a couple of years avoiding leaning into my true thoughts on these topics, and now that it's too late to avoid it anymore, so I'm just going to give them to you directly. The title of the talk here is actually mentions other animals besides horses, and perhaps I'm not going to do that as much justice as I should, because there's a tremendous diversity of ways in which animals, wild and domestic, have shaped this question here. I could spend an hour listing all the different relationships that I have left out of this talk for you here today, either because I have intentionally omitted them, animals like, we just saw a lot about sheep and goat and cattle, or animals that we know are extraordinarily important, but the quality of the information that I have to share with you from like a scientific lens is lower than it really should be for animals like camel, right? But if you know me, my thing is the horse, and I'm mostly going to talk with you here about horses and sort of framing this discussion. This is by the way, this is one of my favorite pictures. I took this is outside of Osh at this really beautiful rock art site called Armagh. And this is looking at the edge of the Fergana Valley here, where some of the drama around horses and the Silk Road has often centers. But the science is telling us that even though the question around we got in a big argument yesterday about whether the Silk Road the concept has a lot of validity. We often think about travelers in a caravan, going down a road with a specific set of animals, and of course over time we've started to unpack that and recognize the flaws in that model. But at the same time, a lot of the good scholarship out there around emerging connectivity across Eurasia does relate to animals in important ways, and this is just one example. Michael's important paper a few years back, looking at the way that pastoral dynamics, right, have sort of organically shaped a kind of a footprint in which, patterns of trade and interactions developed over centuries and millennia. But, a lot of our discussion around this topic focuses on a particular question and a particular animal here, and that's the horse, the domestic horse in particular. So a lot of my scholarship has focused on asking, how and when did people develop transport relationships with the horse, and how did those relationships help shape, these important dynamics and questions? This is a very, very hard question to answer, and there are many, many different perspectives on the topic. And one of the reasons for that is that horses are actually, depending on what your criteria, quite literally like the oldest animal with direct evidence for, hunting, weaponry type relationships. It goes back to the earliest dispersal of hominins into northern latitudes, places like Georgia, Germany, the United Kingdom. We've got evidence of intimate relationships with horses that go back almost deeper than any other animal. And that doesn't just include, little cavemen with spears here, but also early artwork, probably, ceremony and spirituality as far back as the Paleolithic. And so horses have mattered to people for a very, very long time. And it's extraordinarily difficult to track aspects of a relationship that you're just going to have to sort of deal with a fluctuating in and out quality to my talk here, which probably maps the quality of the ideas in my head as well. So it's accurate in certain ways. So it's an extraordinarily hard thing to track, and my focus methodologically has been trying to develop ways that would allow us to look at nuanced parts of the relationship through proxies that we can find in the archaeological record. For me, this is mostly bones, and I think most of the good ones that we have relate to animal bones in particular, right? So we worked on different things over the years, ways that things like transportation might manifest in aspects of the horse skeleton. But there are many other ways to look at this too, and we've dabbled in them, whether they be isotopes around how animals are fed, or genomic dynamics about selective pressure, and of course your classic set of things like historical documents, artifacts, regular old context, vibes, whatever line of evidence that there is. I think it's important that we find ways to bring these things together and explore them. And when we talk about connectivity, some of this came up in Michael's talk. Horses are really at the ground floor for debates about early movements and connections across Central Asia, going back to the discussion around, Yamnaya culture and movements in the 4th millennium BC out of like the Black Sea steppe region as far away as places like the Russian Altai or even the Mongolian Hangai, which is actually significantly further away geographically than is often even depicted on these maps. And you will often see things like this, which are still, I would say, pretty status quo in the literature, maps in which there's a little loop drawn out from the Yamnaya over towards northern Kazakhstan, and an assumption that these movements are actually related in an important way to horse domestication. So I came at this angle. Most of my fieldwork actually comes from Mongolia, which is often on the maps that we'll show today and are often out there, is often just a big sort of gap, a dead space, right, in terms of its integration into some of these thinking. But I kind of got interested in this question because there's some archaeological record for quote-unquote Yamnaya migrations, Afanasevo culture in Mongolia, and horses are nowhere to be found, at least as, to this point, a single horse has never been found associated with that migration. And so I started poking into this question a little bit more out of curiosity more than anything about how some of these older ideas around the relationship of horses to these ancient movements line up with emerging data sets. One of the things that jumped out to me, this is more of an illustrative example than anything, but you go back to like the early to mid 2000s and you'll find a lot of discussion around the archaeological record of the Black Sea, and these, people like to look at artifacts and say, could this be a cheek piece or an interesting piece of a bridle or a bit? And there's nothing wrong with this sort of hypothesizing, but over time we've found a lot of these things to be just either unfounded or demonstrably false. And this is just one example in which eventually Dr. Reinhold here found these things, in position here with cattle skeletons, right? And found out that they're not a cheek piece at all, but there's some sort of a lip ring or a nose ring type device for controlling early cattle here, associated, in this case, not quite Yamnaya, but 4th millennium BC Maikop culture stuff. So actually, even though the Yamnaya question is still being bandied about, most of the discussion around early role of horses, in part because of the high-profile erosion of a couple of famous candidates for Yamnaya relationship to horses that is empirical, has actually shifted over to discussion over the side of Botai. And my goal here is not to start a fight about horse domestication, although always ready if anybody wants to go. But to just kind of review the role of this stuff in relation to Yamnaya. And the site was sort of centered on in key ways because it kind of fits roughly the same time period as the core Yamnaya hypothesis, and potentially there's a little more footing here to discuss horse domestication. So going back to that model, that's the little loop, the little it's like Trump with the Sharpie and the hurricane there around drawing Yamnaya over to Botai. And the site is really fascinating, cool site, 100%-ish horse bones. Back in 2009, Alan Utrecht and a big group of, the who's who of the best thinkers in horse domestication put forward this argument that there was, based on ceramic residues that look like they could be horse milk, and a couple of specific specimens that look like they have pathological features related to horse bridle equipment and horse riding. So I made the mistake of getting involved in this a couple of years ago. After a high-profile finding of animal genetics found out that the horses from Botai, whatever you feel about this site, are actually unrelated in any meaningful way to the horses that we now call domestic horses. Right? These are another taxon of animal entirely. The Przewalski's horse, they have. This is a cute little picture from Instagram here, but it kind of show you the color patterning here that we might recognize from your Paleolithic cave paintings and such. And one of the core ideas here with the Botai model and its relation to Yamnaya is that these are the same animal and they kind of help explain the phenomenon. So setting aside, the fight over whether Botai is like a second domestication event, it's clear that the roots of our core question here lie elsewhere with relation to Botai. And in the same amount of time, we've had some pretty interesting changes in our ability to trace other things in the archaeological record. This is one out of Tina Warner's group, in which they're now looking at patterns in milk and human dentition through dental calculus over time, and kind of seeing how this lines up with the question. Again, this is North Caucasus here, but you can kind of see that the idea that there's a big horse milk revolution here at 3000 BC is not really lining up in the higher quality archaeological records that we can see from the broader region, at least. And in fact, the signature for horses showing up much later. So again, I'll leave by just saying this kind of caused me to reevaluate a little bit the quality of the osteological evidence at Botai. Remember that there's some older critiques here about the demographics, or even literally the presence of harpoons in the ribs of some of these poor horses, that might point us towards thinking of it as another type of site. And again, this turned into a very, very contentious fight that I very much regret starting. But nonetheless, stand by some of the questions around these little bit of osteological evidence for horse transport. If you don't believe my osteological critiques here, one of the simplest arguments is there was no invention, as far as I can tell technologically, of a bridle or a bit for another 1,000 to 1,500 years after Botai. So, all right, so We can fight about that later if you like over a beer. Nonetheless leaves us with the question of when did this journey of horse transport begin, and how did it begin to shape our dynamics of connectivity, whether we call them the Silk Road or something else. Now, one of these, again, we were talking about large sample integrative genomic projects that has been really amazing and transformative in this question has been with the animal genomics side of things through the work of Dr. Ludwig Orlando and some of his postdocs and collaborators, in which they now see, basically a sort of a genomic sort of search for the geographic origins by fingerprinting, genotyping hundreds of horses from all across the continent and radiocarbon dating, and there's just sort of seeing where that first ancestor of domestic horse shows up. And what they've found over a series of papers here has been that there's almost kind of a lightning strike replacement. And here the kind of orange color on this, we've got Denver Broncos colors here for me, I guess. The orange color here is any wild type non-related to domestic lineage, and blue is the early domestic horse lineages. And you see this almost instantaneous total turnover for much of Eurasia, from basically anything but into a single lineage of animal that dispersed largely across the continent here in a very short period of time. And the interesting thing about this pattern is that it actually lines up with some of the conclusions that folks that were doing, old school, looking at the archaeological context of this region from the early to mid 20th century, right? It's the first genomic evidence for horse domestication is almost lining up exactly with the appearance of horses in Sintashta burials around 2000 BC. There's a little bit of earlier archaeological record of things like wheeled vehicles that look like chariots in this region. But worth pointing out, there's extraordinary technological innovations at this exact moment associated as well. These are the spoked wheel for the chariot, and this is the oldest evidence for something going through an animal's mouth to help control it, right? Which I think is pretty important when you think about horses. They're dangerous, unruly, fast, strong, and this, up until this point, people actually, since 3000 BC at least, have been controlling other equids in places like Mesopotamia using that old nose ring system, right? They were not just riding donkeys or putting donkeys in carts, but also breeding them. I didn't put any slides in this, but it's interesting. Genetics is actually showing crossbreeding, with the onager or Syrian wild ass to make them faster and stronger, and clearly doing a lot. There's a broader system here of technological experimentation that this stuff fits into in an interesting and important way. So the big picture here, again, suggests that whatever you want to believe about Botai, the domestication of horses in the western steppes of Eurasia was pretty much a lightning strike type of process. And from 2000 BC, or the genetics numbers you'll see might go like 2200. They're talking about lineages rather than like necessarily interactions. But from 2000 BC, we're talking about a period of about 500 to 600 years in which horses spread across huge swaths of the continent. And it might have taken place in kind of two different ways. There's this kind of interestingly slower vibe to the first appearance of horses in the kind of horizontal, lateral, across the steppes way. And it may not have always involved a ton of migration, right? These are areas, grassland areas, where folks in some of these areas were already pastoralists, might have been a more, to use a annoying old school word, with diffusion type situation in some of these areas. And in other cases, the arrival of horse was a total disaster, and it took 2 years or something, right? Like the places like, and again, I'm not a classicist, so excuse me for the simplicity here, but whether we're talking about places like ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, potentially even, you know, in this valley, the arrival of the horse might have been an incursion of mean-spirited people from places where you could raise horses, right? And very, very quick process that had much more of a military energy to it. I'm using my best Gen Z language here for you all today. For me, a lot of the interesting piece of this was the beginning of the story in the Mongolian steppes here, right? So my bread and butter is the earliest, you know, horse culture here in Mongolia, beginning around, you know, 1200 BC. The spread of horses here obviously had a really important role in giving us a kind of pastoralism that's a little different in Mongolia, right? Horses are pretty important here to this story from the beginning. The steppes of Mongolia are, you know, they're cold, they're dry, they're pretty rough place to try to farm in a lot of these areas, you know, higher elevation. And so horse really took us from an area in which we, you know, the Afanasevo had a pretty rough go of it in Mongolia. The Yamnaya migrants were like hanging out on the mountain margins for dear life, and, you know, had almost no genetic legacy, you know, into the later Bronze Age and beyond here. But the horse really had an impact here, and that impact was had some interesting, you know, stages to it that I'd like to kind of share with you all a little bit here today. The first, obviously, you know, horses did make a dramatic entrance to China when they arrived, right? And that initially might have been, you know, a fun novelty for the Shang Emperor, but it very quickly turned into sort of unseating the political authority of China and East Asia, with the Western Zhou, you know, leveraging expertise in chariots and quantity, almost certainly, of horses having a big role in that process. And yet again, we have not actually answered this question here about when did horse riding and sort of take root, and is there a difference here between this initial spread and some of the later, you know, roles that horses ended up playing in connecting ancient Asia. And this is one of the questions I think that's one of the strangest and most difficult to answer, because many people who ride horses, you know, in the American West, you know, have the experience of, like, there are feral horses. You often will capture those, train them, ride them, sell them at auction, and they become domestic horses. It's very strange to think about a situation. Why would you be basically making these little cars with 2 horses and a bunch of complex technology, as opposed to just riding them into battle from 30,000 BC, right? And it took me a while to sort of wrap my head around why I think there's some changes in patterning and how people were using horses. The trick here is that actually people were riding horses from a very early age in the horse domestication story. And we don't have a lot of direct evidence of it, but there are out there. And this is an example. Unfortunately, the kind of degradation of the panel here makes it difficult to see. But I took this. This is at the Temple of Ramses the Great in Luxor. I took it last year. And this is a huge, huge panel of a chariot battle in which, if you look really, really hard, Where's Waldo style, you can find 1 or 2 people riding a horse. You can't see it super well, but this poor fellow is sort of naked and maybe holding something. And the evidence here suggests that when people were riding horses in most of the 2nd millennium BC, it was clearly kind of a stripped down, either speed at all costs, or in this guy it was probably like a scout or a messenger. It's not that people hadn't figured out how to ride an equid. In fact, they were riding donkeys since at least 3000 BC. It's probably more about context and quality of communication and control, and perhaps a little bit about horse behavior as well. We now know, and Michael highlighted a little bit of that in yesterday when we were talking, right, that there's clear evidence of people riding horses in certain parts of Inner Asia at a very early age too. And this might be more like 12 or 1300 BC rather than 2000. But last year we found some interesting stuff as well, melting out of the mountain ice in Mongolia, areas where you would never get a chariot, some evidence that people were kind of clipping a broken piece of hoof on the top of a mountain, probably in using horses for packing out Argali sheep that they were hunting up there, right? So it's not a question of whether people were riding horses. It's a question of when and why. And one of the most informative things I found is this is as far as I can tell, the oldest depiction of mounted cavalry in the historic record that has any sort of date with it in the world. And this is a panel from Assyria dated to around 900 BC. And it shows a really, really important thing if you can kind of tease it out. These are actually teams of the first sort of mounted cavalry. They're actually teams of two. And you got one little pointy hat guy holding the reins on one side. They're depicted side by side, so it's hard to see. And the other, right, with the bow. And I think what this shows us is that early horse riding was still a little dicey, right? It was a low control situation. Early cavalry, basically taking this team of two approach from the chariot days, a working together so that somebody could fight and someone else could kind of help control, right? And one of the things that started to change this pattern in an important way is improved mechanisms of control, right? Innovation of things like the jointed metal bit, which actually might go back to the 1200 BC and might be a part of why Egyptian scouts were starting to do this stuff a little bit as well. I believe this second shift, which was clearly a little bit less of a lights on, lights off moment, had a little fuzzier edge to it, but in which basically people began to use individual horses in a not just mounted combat, but obviously other kinds of transport and movement and trade and communication, was a fundamental one in a pretty important way for the steppes, right? And we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like and why. This is a paper from, again, a couple of years ago, a human genomics paper kind of tracking, this is just a map showing the flow of genomic material across the continent in different windows of time. Fortunately, not the most well-dated or finest resolution here, but you can kind of see some interesting patterns here along the patterns that we were just discussing. Early on, you can see the signature of things like the movement of Yamnaya people across the continent. You can also see a pretty cool and clear signature for, the movement of, horses and the people who domesticated them and, out of Western Asia into different areas of the continent. I'll note as well, you will not see anything happening in Mongolia. It's not because nothing happened in Mongolia, it's that this paper, just like many others, didn't quite get a lot done out there. But then the most interesting piece to me is this final bullet point here in the kind of late second, early millennium BC. You see this sort of vortex pulling effect of people into the grasslands, right? And my assertion, and again, I'm totally oversimplifying. I'm sure there's a lot of ways you could, sort of poke holes in the specifics here. But my assertion is that this kind of represents the centering of the steppe in a way that is fundamentally linked to changes in horses and their impacts on the rest of ancient Eurasia. And I'll show you another example. This is maybe a little bit more specific to my area, and that's Mongolia. So I told you the spread of horses into Mongolia here is maybe 13, 1200 BC, which you kind of see the genomic landscape of that depicted in the top panel. But it's this first millennium BC, and specifically the rise of the Xiongnu Empire here, in which you really see this exact same effect kind of playing out here. The kind of inputs here from all directions, and the eastern steppe kind of emerging as a central place. And so this kind of genomic patterning here, I would say, is also reflected in other lines of evidence too. And one of the most cool and dramatic ones, I apologize because this is a little bit not safe for work scene here. This is a recovery from an elite burial in Mongolia. This is, again, not a classicist, but this is Hercules and Omphale, is that correct? I don't know. Anyway, this is a scene out of essentially Greek mythology, although it may be more towards the Roman period that this artifact was actually produced. But there are other things like blue Roman glass. There are, Persian carpets and jade objects from China, and items in the Mongolian archaeological record which speak to the emergence of these steppes as a place of truly global reach. And there's an interesting convergence here, right, between things like, high-level bird's-eye view human genomics and emerging patterns in the archaeological record as well. Why is it that I would say that there's a link here to horses? Well, one of the other things we've been working on the last few years is trying to understand the way that introduction of horsemanship impacted this part of the world. Well, maybe not the Californian coast, but certainly the Great Plains of the United States. And we also did a similar sort of experiment exploring things down in Argentinian Patagonia, right? And one of the dynamics that emerges in both places in a very dramatic way is this kind of movement of people and resources and migrations and connectivity into the grasslands related to the shifting geopolitics of horses. Essentially, it became worth everybody's while to be where you could raise large numbers of horses. These ended up being the engine of sort of political authority, economic power, cultural power. And I encourage you, if you ever get curious, open the first 2 chapters of the Diaries of Marco Polo, because we often think about the cultural context of Marco Polo as like, an explorer, or people talk about Orientalism. The guy, I don't think, after reading it, I don't think the guy ever really wanted to go to the steppes of Mongolia, and he spent years trying to get out, right? And I think it nicely represents the sort of gravitational energy that horses gave to the geopolitics of the grasslands and the steppes, right? Marco Polo essentially was told by a Khan on the edges of the Black Sea, like, nope, you're going this way, buddy. And he spent years negotiating, can I please leave, to Kublai Khan, and eventually he kind of won out. But this energy here represents the ways in which horses made places that were, back in the Afanasevo days, not a great place for even necessarily for pastoralism, into thriving sort of global centers of connectivity in different ways. I'll say one other final point here to kind of wrap up, which is I haven't talked at all about the Silk Road. I was talking to you about the steppes, right? And the way that the grasslands themselves, I think was it David Christian or somebody come up with the idea of steppe roads. I don't even think of it as a steppe road as much as a kind of a horse vortex here. In certain ways. But at the same time, the entirety of ancient Eurasia wanted horses, right? And in many ways started to need them for their own, political, geopolitical, economic ambitions. And the emergence of horse riding, horse cavalry really gave us, important changes into what horses were. You started to get really special, even aesthetic things changing across ancient Eurasia. And this is a cool paper out of the Orlando group in which they argued that new coat color types coming out of certain areas of Central Asia by the mid first millennium BC, even things like the Palomino coat, for example. And we know from historic records, right, that as early as the unification of China in the late first millennium BC, there was an explicit desire for a supply of horses that could help combat this changing geopolitical landscape and also serve their own needs. I'm going to fast forward here to just show a little map here. So the Xiongnu Empire, again, which started by the end of the first millennium BC, was a very aggressive crystallization and organization of the steppes. Really caused a big change to the sort of landscape of East Asia. From a very early stage, the horse kind of helped connect the steppes in China, right? And we see that by the Shang dynasty and the Zhou, you had a fair amount of back and forth between the steppes and settled agricultural civilizations nearby because everybody wanted horses. Mongolian folks today have a millennia-long tradition of liking, shiny, beautiful things from China. And this process started really early on. But with this emergence of kind of like confederated and militarized relationships with the steppes, all of a sudden there was kind of a problem here, is where in China can we really get large numbers of high quality horses? And this logic is spelled out pretty explicitly, by imperial leadership in the Han Dynasty, for example, about leading expeditions to places like Central Asia to try to get horses. Now, I'm not here to argue that the entire Silk Road or whatever is just a play for Chinese folks to get a supply of horses that are not from the steppes, but it very much is spelled out as one of the reasons for more formalized, more systematic, more official energy being put into these trade systems that linked, again, pretty rough country here. China is lovely, but like the Taklamakan Desert is a tough place to put a highway, right? And pretty difficult transit involved in linking some of these regions. And I think the shifting need for horses in this landscape is one of these motivating factors that emerged at this time and continued to be so a shaping force for many centuries ahead. And just to highlight the work of a couple of colleagues and friends here that's kind of cool, is that, we see these things changing preferences for horses of higher quality, so to speak, right? And in this case, it kind of means taller, right? That's one of the main things that changed about a riding horse versus a chariot horse is, a taller horse is advantageous in a way that a chariot horse probably height doesn't really impact your quality of your outcome there. So these are the horses from the mausoleum of the Qin Emperor there, and emerging to be kind of taller in comparison to earlier periods. This desire and trade for horses, again, a key factor even in much later periods. So this is a petroglyph from our mutual friend and colleague, Dr. Zahir, who works in northern Pakistan. I think it's cool because it's got a little, obviously Chinese, essentially, brand on the flank there, and showing this, clear role of that desire and that connection, even in very far away regions here in later centuries. And I think that continued to shape these dynamics across Eurasia over longer stretches of time. So I want to conclude by just, showing, I think it started, ultimately the role of horses in shaping connections really started in reshaping steppes as a place, instead of a place you would sometimes place, it was a center, a place where you would go in order to raise horses, to access horses, a place where you might go even if you didn't want to because the Khan made you go. And in response, right, you also had a component of horses impacting other trade routes that in many ways are sort of designed to go around or designed to supply because of changing dynamics in the steppe. And this would also include not just silk roads, but connections to highland Himalaya. Sorry about the commotion there. And people are just really excited about the content here. And again, would ultimately begin to shape other kinds of trade networks across, the terrestrial, quote-unquote, old world. Finally, the steppes, I think the archaeological record of places like Mongolia have been left out in an important way from some of these discussions, and we can think of the role of grasslands in another way as potentially hotbeds of innovation and change in the dynamics of ancient Eurasia. This is a picture from a find by my colleague, or our colleague, Byra, and a big team of folks a few years ago. This is probably the oldest saddle ever directly dated in ancient Eurasia, and it comes out of Western Mongolia circa 300 CE, and it's probably paired with stirrup technology too, right? So these are developments that would shape, Eastern Europe, the Turkic Khaganate, in a technological sense, and give us other footings for quote-unquote connectivity that might have been a little bit unpleasant for some folks on the receiving end, right? So I guess that's where I'll kind of leave you here, is that I think that domestic animals, clearly played an important role. And while some of these have nothing to do with horses, the emerging record is showing that the role of horse was a very dynamic one in building, initially dispersals and later in kind of reshaping the political geography and centering grasslands as these, central places. At the same time, the lack of horses was also an important force in motivating folks to seek them, right? And to potentially seek out new trade partnerships with areas, mountain areas, especially like those of Eurasia, those of the high Himalaya, where, economic systems focused on horse trade could kind of emerge. So that's where I'll leave you. And now, if you want to read other things to make you mad about horse domestication, I do have a new book out right now, and happy to chat a little bit more. All right, thanks.
Hi, thanks for coming for the presentation. I'm not kind of curious. I noticed this is the second presentation so far, but I'm assuming later ones. I noticed that you're using the Mercator projection map a lot, but we're talking about land distance, and I'm wondering, have you considered using other maps to show the true scale of distance?
I'm terrible at maps, and I did not make those. I just paid someone else to do them. So that's a good point. And ultimately, there's a lot of. So let's put up one of my faulty maps here, right?
Well, not faulty, but I'm just curious if it's distorting the land distance.
I think there's a lot of value in rethinking the way, ultimately this is just probably an unthinking shorthand of one of the things that's been most interesting to me working in Mongolia is that right and left and east and west are directionalized in a way that sort of explodes my American brain, and gives us, also gives us a flipped, which side of the map is up perspective. I think it's really worthwhile to rethink how we visualize these things. I certainly think there would be a lot of value in improving this thing. I've got to the point where I'm too busy to ever try to make a map, and I just quickly pay other people to do them. But a lot of assumptions are replicated through out of expedience a lot of times in the way we think about this. So I think that's a great suggestion. I would love to see some better attempts at this.
Thanks, Will. That was great. I haven't heard you talk about your horse. I just haven't been in the same spaces in a while, so it's
Yeah.
really a pleasant experience to hear those thoughts pulled together in such an articulate way. Her comment about the maps has me a bit disarmed because I kind of agree at one level. I'm not sure that there's necessarily an answer to it. I mean, my maps, I use the same projection, so you're not abnormal in that way. But it does bring up a question about the way in which we correlate different data sets. So my bigger problem is not these maps at all. It's the Domgard maps. I've kind of pretty publicly criticized that study. Not
This
against, yeah, but for example, if you look at the middle panel, panel B, that one is based on I think 2 Andronovo period genomes.
Yeah.
Total 2.
And I think there's almost nothing in there for, so throw this out.
Yeah, I mean, this is a different, but the reason why I mention it, right, is because the point you make is not really about the genomes, right? It's just the compelling overlap in these arrows and the ones that kind of relate to your...
Yeah, I like this one better anyway.
Yeah, and I love this kind of representation much better. And it is important only from the perspective that, if you go back to the Domgard picture, you don't have to flip back to it, but
I will. Just for you.
Those images, you could find those in 1945 Soviet publication.
Yeah.
That's exactly what they did, right? And you could also find, that image being based on ceramic typologies or whatever else. So in a lot of ways, we are all, and this is just the nature of how we communicate through maps, and even my own studies have been guilty of this at times, of making these big arrow maps as if these are real processes.
Yeah.
And so my question to you is this: what we did in the 2019 genetic study was one thing that I think really pertains to that horse domestication question that I haven't heard anybody speak about.
Yeah.
The spread of genomic material from West Asia to East Asia and ultimately to India throughout the second millennium BC takes about 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So if you look at let's take Sintashta as one chronological benchmark, 2100, 2200 BC. that genomic combination makes it to Southern Altai, Eurasian mountain corridor by about 1700, so that's pretty quick, 300 years. But then put your mindset around 300 years, right? With a horse. You're talking about a punctuated, like there's really quite fast bursts.
Yeah.
So the genomics are actually in some sense irrelevant only to the extent that if you're right, which I have every reason to believe you are, the genomics are slower than what the horse can do.
Yeah.
Right? So like the horse could actually be the thing, and I like this.
I think this is a great example of that, yeah.
Exactly. So I love that point because we're constantly thinking of migration as the distributor of technologies,
Yeah.
as opposed to technologies being the pull factor for what we ultimately see as genetic transformation. And because we know, at least with the density of dates, or density of samples that we do have from the step, given the more recent study, that the genomic process is a long and slow one, actually. There's a lot of admixture, a lot of back and forth, a lot of different arrows and things happening. I like the idea that horses are now in this mix as something that could draw you out from whatever your local context is into a new space. And so I just think rewording that, the logic of how you put it, rather than saying the genetics is kind of a, it almost seemed like you were saying, look, the genetics prove this, but in fact, it's the other way around. The horses prove the other.
No, I think you're totally right. I think that's very, very clear from looking at, the Mongolian example in detail. And I do agree, we just have this, it's very hard to think at continental timescales, and there's the human brain, we're tended to we like to just draw arrows, and there's an implied migration, and the more that I dive into specific corners, the more it's clear, none of that is actually characterizing. The only thing that you could really draw a meaningfully correct arrow from here would be things like dispersal of West Asian domestic animals one time, right? But that's not actually what people are often describing or interested in. And in Mongolia, the arrival of the horse did not, as far as I can tell, didn't actually... We can point out one or two like strangers who arrived, right? From the human genomic stuff that's there. But it's not like there is a big movement here. If there's a movement, it kind of looks more like the movement of the Blackfoot out of Alberta into Montana, rather than like a triumphant migration of Indo-European, heroes of horse domestication. And I think it's really important to figure out how to describe and share those things better, because we're stumbling into that recognition through the scientific results and still using the old lingo that might have been cooked up in the Soviet literature, or V. Gordon Childe, or whoever it is that we're and it's important to rethink that. So that's a very good point. And
I was just wondering, in regards to the skeletal evidence or things like bit impact and breathing pressure, at any point in time are we seeing any evidence or pathologies related to the hoof, or anything related to evidence for stabling, anything like hoof trimming showing up that indicate horses are being made to stay put more often than before?
Yeah, so one of the extremely pathology-friendly parts of the skeleton is the sort of the lower limb. And I would say that we very rarely, other than when you're climbing on a glacier or whatever, are actually going to find like keratin sheath of a hoof, unless you're dealing with a mummy. So it can be hard to assess actions that people took around maintenance of quote-unquote hoof health. In general, the folks of the steppe had almost no problem. Like the natural hoof health in a lot of these areas is, this sort of self-maintaining, because these are the conditions that horses have their hooves have evolved to deal with. The pathology, though, of the lower limb is a pretty useful metric for certain kinds of horse transport. In particular, we found that it's the front limb situation, and this is a sample of Chinese chariot horses shown in this first diagram here in the top left. That's a high impact, point of contact skeletally for horse transport. Potentially a little bit less so with, mounted riding, although I'm not sure we've really quantified that difference. And but again, there's nothing of the sort in our earliest assemblages, and in fact, almost no proper paleopathology of even, you know, Sintashta, Petrovka, other like early 2nd millennium BC horse assemblages.
I'm thinking, this wonderful presentation. I'm thinking about camels and alpacas and elephants, right? And other beasts that can that have certain demands. I mean, do your models hold up for moving into those species?
You mean in terms of the skeletal stuff? Yeah. So I think
have you worked on that?
there's a big lag in our ability to ask those questions from an empirical standpoint in a lot of other taxa. In particular, right? Like I think camels are such an interesting one, and they're one of those where like even putting a number or a spot on things like a Bactrian camel is a total disaster because we really don't have the basic pieces figured out as to, you know, when that started. I would love if folks were doing more animal skeletal pathology stuff to figure out the origins of transport. Like a few vignettes of like donkey and cattle are really the only other ones that there's like a archaeozoological footing. We've been recently working on trying to understand the same with reindeer transport in northern Mongolia. And the camelid question, probably there's most information, you would find more information on this topic in places like the Andes and camelid domestication. But again, the lines of evidence around there are still a little bit like box plots of size over time and stuff in terms of figuring out when did people actually domesticate, what is domestication, what aspects of the relationship are we tracing. I think it's very, very promising and important scholarship to try to build out an empirical record that you can then look at changes to human ecology. But I would say that when it's not anchored in the animal skeletal stuff, it can be so hard to figure out. One example that comes to mind is like the Tibetan plateau and yak. I mean, if you look at pollen records, some people would say yak domestication is 10,000 years old, whereas if you looked at like, you know, the recent animal genomics, what is it? You're going to be in the 1st millennium BC somewhere. And until you start to stitch these things together, it becomes very hard to assess, you know, the relationship between transport changes and human lifeways and whatever. And it's important to do all the lines of evidence that you can to get something like a coherent story. So
the horse is well positioned for your argument because the data is just so robust.
Our data is a total disaster, but this is the best I can do. And I would say it's much worse in most other taxa. So.
That's a good place.
All right.
Thank
Thanks.
you. So I just want to welcome Milinda. She was able to listen to William's talk, so she's back in. And I just I want to apologize to you too that it went that way. So welcome Milinda, who's going to talk about globalizing mnemonic geographies. So please help me welcome her.
Thank you so much, Sandra and Frank, for inviting me and making it possible to present online with the necessary hiccups. But I'm here and I'm very happy to be here online. I've looked at the program and I see it's quite science-driven, focusing on climate change, local pastoralism. But my contribution today is an historical one, and I will present a cultural approach to the impact of nomads on ancient Eurasian connectivity, focusing on what I will call the globalization of memory. And I will be focusing on Central Asia in the second half of the 1st millennium BC. And I think for this audience I need to specify that I focus on southern Central Asia, so the lands east of the Caspian Sea to the Hindu Kush, of which Parthia, Bactria, Sogdiana, and the Scythian lands to the north, in quotation marks, will feature most in this talk. Now, from a Mediterranean perspective, these Central Asian lands were not only considered as geographically distant, but also culturally and morally distant, as most of you know. Central Asian peoples were variously associated with nomadic lifestyles, and they were described in literary sources as invincible mounted archers who did not practice farming and were therefore seen as lazy and inferior because they didn't work for their food. They didn't toil for their food, and were therefore considered as not self-sufficient. Autarkia, which was praised highly from Greek perspectives. Now, according to Strabo, the Scythians, Bactrians, and Sogdians, they shared similar lifestyles, so that these lands of Central Asia were often culturally confused and fused with one another. Now, these literary descriptions about nomadic peoples, nomadic lifestyles, are partly anchored in the real ecology of Central Asia, where different landscapes and their affordances meet. Scholarship of the past decades, including of those here today, have shown a diverse spectrum of sedentary and mobile subsistence strategies across Central Asia, demonstrating diversity and plurality. Also recent scholarship has shed light on the fact that Central Asian peoples were not merely peripheral to historical processes, but actually pivotal actors in multi-historical dynamics. Think of trade, warfare, and elite exchange. Yet, despite the evidence for Central Asian diversity, Central Asian plurality, the memory or the image of the Central Asian nomads and their lands has been relatively stable and relatively significant. So we see the same stereotypes of the Central Asian nomad, we see it coming back and recurring throughout time. And today, I want to investigate this further by presenting a cultural approach to macrohistorical dynamics in Eurasia, which is informed by three bodies of research. The first is globalization, or globalization theory. The second is ancient geography, and the third is memory or memory studies. Now let me start with globalization. Since the 1990s or so, we've all experienced it. Academia experienced a huge wave of new scholarship, starting in the social sciences with the introduction of globalization research. Think of names such as Arjun Apodolai, Anthony Giddens, John Thomason, and others. This huge new field of social sciences also trickled down into the field of classics, ancient studies, which is my background, though with some delay, admittedly. But now we see that ancient studies increasingly adopt globalization as a framework. Ancient studies have defined it for antiquity, and I quote here, as a surge of intense, long-distance interaction, the creation of global culture, increasing interconnectivity and the awareness of that connectivity. And in this presentation, I will argue that one of the ways in which this awareness manifests itself is in the adoption and adaptation of common geographical memories that were repurposed and recontextualized. So in other words, I will be talking about the globalization of memory. Now this brings me to the second body of research, geography and its impact on structures of identity, so how people place themselves in the world. What we see, despite increasing connectivity in antiquity, the conceptualization of the ancient world as demarcated at the edges by strange folk, as you can see here, remained quite conventional in ancient literature. So we see here a modern reconstruction of the worldview in the 4th century BC, with Scythians in the north, Indians in the east, Ethiopians in the south, and Celts in the west. Now, as you can see, Central Asia, the region that I'm interested in, was located in the far northeast, so between the far north and the far east, between Scythia and India. And here it really should be pointed out that ancient geography worked inherently differently than modern geography. So ancient geography was fundamentally descriptive rather than cartographic. It didn't produce maps, such as you can see on this modern reconstruction, but it really relied on the power of language to imagine places through stories, retellings, descriptions, and evocations that we find in various textual genres. So what we can say is that ancient geography was discursive in nature. And this brings me to the realm of memory. Through collective memory, as defined by Maurice Halbach, people can imagine remembering things that they were not witness to. Memory studies have pointed out that the significance of memory as a tool for identity formation, as well as the fact that memory is fluid and memory is subject to manipulation and negotiation. Jan Assmann also introduced the term mnemotrodes, referring to specific places and even entire landscapes that can evoke specific cultural memories. And for this talk, I also used a scholarship by Ahmed Said. Said was, of course, mainly known from his work on Orientalism as a discourse, but he also applied the notion of a cultural archive. Said argued that a Western identity is formed through a distinct cultural archive of the Orient as its other, and this cultural archive refers to a body of knowledge, narratives, histories, and representations that are constructed over time to make sense of others and thereby defining one's own identity, a worldview, power structures, and certain power relations. Now, taken all together, this paper therefore builds on the intersection between these three bodies of research, between globalization, geography, and memory, in order to argue that in the second half of the first millennium BC, the Eurasian continent became increasingly interconnected, and so too the geographical memories of the Central Asian nomads and their lands. I'll try to show that memory of the Central Asian nomad was not just a negative stereotype, but that it accumulated a global significance that could inspire geopolitical action. To make this argument, I briefly explore 5 case studies as insights into the cultural archive of geographical imaginations of the Central Asian nomads. I'm going to discuss Cyrus the Great, Cyrus II of Persia, Alexander the Great, Antiochus III, the Seleucid king, Ephidamus I of Bactria, and Mithridates I of Parthia. So we have one Achaemenid king, 2 Macedonian kings, and 2 Central Asian rulers. All of these kings were imperial kings that were all remembered as great men in the sources, while historically they can also be seen as great connectors of the continent of Asia. These kings also all had distinct interactions with the Central Asian nomad, which then created distinct historical impact. Now let me first start with Cyrus the Great, Cyrus of Persia, the founder, of course, of the Achaemenid Empire. Our main sources about Cyrus are written by Greeks, but there's an important exception, which is the Cyrus cylinder that you see here in Babylon. This was a cylinder that was dedicated after 539 BC. And cylinder tells us that Cyrus adopted the universalist language of earlier Babylonian and Assyrian kings, claiming, as you can see here, kingship of the universe, great kingship, as well as kingship over the 4 quarters of the world. Now, although rule over the 4 quarters of the world was claimed earlier by other nations and kings, Cyrus was actually the first king who could claim the concrete achievement of these 4 quarters of the world through his campaigns in Central Asia. Herodotus tells us that Cyrus's campaigns to Central Asia were due to a desire to subdue the Massagetae, who were described as a great and mighty people, and they were also associated with Scythian lifestyles. Now, according to the story, his motivation to subdue them was that he was destined to achieve more than what mortals could, namely victory over the Scythian lands. So we see that the Scythian lands in Central Asia were therefore associated with invincible peoples in the far northeast, and victory over them would grant glory and kingship over the world, over the 4 corners of the world. Now, we know nothing from the recent sources about his campaigns in Central Asia except a brief mention in Babylonian documents that he died in 530 BC. However, we hear more about his death in a Greek literary narrative of the 5th and 4th century BC that describe that Cyrus died in Central Asia. We have Herodotus, who mentions that he was slain by Tomiris, queen of the Macrohistorical, quite a vivid description. He mentioned that Tomiris filled a skin with human blood, put Cyrus's head in the skin, and spoke words of insult to the dead man. Diodorus of Sicily, another author, provides a shorter, less vivid description, as he mentioned that Cyrus was crucified by a Scythian queen. Another version of Theseus has Cyrus died peacefully in Persia, but only after he conquered the nomadic lands of the Saka, the Persian word for the Scythians. So although several stories about Cyrus' death circulated, most stories that we encounter place the last years of this great king, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, among nomads in Central Asia, and this is quite significant. Now, Cyrus' motivation to march northeastwards might have been motivated by Assyrian memories of the invasion of Cimmerian nomads in the 7th century BC. Now, the Cimmerians were not Central Asian peoples, but they did invade Assyria from the general direction of the northeast, from the Caucasus on the other side of the Caspian Sea. This text that you see here is from an Assyrian inscription that enumerated various conquered peoples, peoples that he had a victory over. But most space of the inscription, a large space actually, is dedicated to the figure of Tugdami. He was the king of the mountain dwellers, who was here described as impious, godless, and belligerent, associated with the transgression of divine norms. In other Assyrian texts, Tugdami was also known as king of the nomads. So interacting with what we see here is an interaction with existing knowledge of nomads of the northeast that might have played a role in Cyrus' own march to Central Asia, perhaps to gain prestige by marching onto ungodly wrongdoers. Now, whatever precise details about Cyrus' death, the stories about his death that placed it in Central Asia must have played a role in the campaigns of his successor Darius, who also went to the northeast around 519 BC. Now, the results of Darius' campaigns are presented here in the Pisatun inscription inscribed on the rock face of Mount Pisatun in Iran. This inscription describes Darius' rise to power. It also describes his conquest over rebellion regions in the Achaemenid Empire. And importantly, so almost a third of the list of peoples that you see here on the slide were situated in Central Asia. So this is quite significant, or shows that Central Asians were significant enough to be mentioned on this important inscription. What we also see here in this piece of inscription is that this very long text also culminates in a very elaborate description of capture of the Saka, which is the Persian designation for Scythians. The Pisatun inscription was accompanied by figures that you can see here of the 9 rebel kings that were brought before Darius, and we see that the largest of these 9 rebel kings here at the far right, the largest of them was the Saka king, the Scythian king. So we can identify him from his clothing. He wears a pointed cap, has a beard, wears a kaftan and trousers, and there's also a minor inscription above the figure that actually identifies this figure as Skuncha, the Saka king. Now, the imperial integration of the Saka with pointed hats is also proudly propagated on the walls of the Atadana in Persepolis, the great audience hall where it was visible to everyone. And here we see the Saka delegation bearing gifts for the king, next to alongside other Central Asian groups such as the Bactrians and the Gandhari. But the Saka are here recognizable from their pointed hats, the common arms. You see here the bow and the arrow, the short sword, as well as the tribute of a horse, which evoked the idea of mounted arches of Central Asia. Now, in the same period, we see a sudden popularity of Scythian archers with pointed hats, the same pointed hats that we've seen before, on Greek face paintings of the 6th century BC. And I would argue that these 6th century depictions serve to evoke the massive extent of the Achaemenid Empire, represented by its most distant people. The Achaemenid Empire, in Greek perspective, was so enormous that it extended across the whole known world as imagined by the Greeks, and even reaching the edge of the world, which was imagined to be inhabited by Scythians. So later on, after 480 BC, in context of the Greco-Persian Wars, the figure of the Scythian fused with that of the Persian to emphasize Persian barbaric otherness as opposed to the civilized Greek self. And this then aligned with the ideology of the Persian enemy defeated in battle, which is echoed here on the base paintings, where you can see the Persian figure in a losing stance against a Greek hoplite. Now what we see here is that the Greeks not only adopted the Scythian figure from Achaemenid visualized geographical memory, but also changed its significance. So first it was used to evoke the enormous distance and the enormous extent of the Achaemenid Empire, and then it was later on used to evoke the ultimate Oriental other in context of the Greco-Persian Wars. So this brings me to my third case study, which is Alexander the Great. Alexander III of Macedonia was certainly influenced by stories and imagery about the distant northeastern lands, as well as the legendary death of Cyrus the Great and the traumatizing experience of the Persian invasion of Greece. After burning down Persepolis in 313, through which he avenged the burning of Athens in 480 BC, his push further east to Central Asia, or further northeast to Central Asia, conveniently led him to follow Cyrus's footsteps. Literary sources provide us with very lively descriptions of Alexander's campaigns in Bactria and Sogdiana, where he founded the city on the Scythian frontier to mark his furthest victory at the end of the world. Now, this foundation was called Alexandria Escata, the furthest, which replaced the earlier named city of Cyrus. Sources also inform us that Alexandria Escata would be an outpost to defend the area against incursions of barbarians, and it's here implicit that these barbarians actually refer to nomads. Alexander's march and city foundation in Sogdiana represented his conquest of the edge of the world, and this conquest enabled him to emulate and even surpass mythical figures such as Heracles, Dionysus, Cyrus, and Semiramis, all of whom found their limit in this region of the world, according to Pliny. Narrative traditions further proclaim that it was this expedition against the invincible Scythians that brought the continent of Asia into his subjection. This was ultimately what gave Alexander kingship over the world. Now it is well known that Alexander's Hellenistic successors all drew legitimacy by connecting themselves to Alexander's memory as well as his charisma, and also that they further developed the idea of universal kingship. The Seleucid Empire incorporated Central Asia, and this region gained special significance because the dynasty was born from a Central Asian woman, the wife of Seleucus I, who came from Bactria or Sogdiana. It's debatable. Now, several Seleucid kings marched eastwards to Central Asia, not only in imitation of Alexander, but also to draw resources and strengthen relations with the homeland of Antiochus I, the son of the founder. Of the Seleucid kings, Antiochus III, depicted here, is especially interesting concerning his relations with Central Asian nomads. What we hear from Polybius is that Antiochus III marches east onto the now independent Greco-Bactrian kingdom, which broke away from the Seleucid Empire earlier. Polybius provides a very lively narrative of the events. After unsuccessfully sieging the capital of Bactria, Antiochus is approached by Euthydemus, the king of Bactria. Euthydemus demands acknowledgement of his name and state of king in Bactria by offering an alliance against, quote, considerable hordes of approaching nomads, multitudes of nomads, in order to safeguard the land from barbarism. According to the story, Antiochus agrees, and in this narrative, Euthydemus becomes a vassal king who helps keep the nomads at bay, so the nomads that were a danger to all. Now, in literary traditions, it was because of this expedition to the edges of the world that Antiochus gained the title the Great, and also this expedition which made him worthy of his kingship over the continent of Asia. So we see here again an echo of Alexander and Cyrus marching to the ends of the earth to nomadic borderlands through which kings could claim universal kingship. Now, although only the Seleucid kings went to Central Asia in the Hellenistic period, the march to the end of the world was ideologically so powerful that it could be appropriated by other empires already before Antiochus III. Recent scholarship by Shane Wallace and Rolf Stoltman have pointed to a certain ripple effect in the global context of imperial competition. In the Hellenistic world, imperial claims to distant conquest did not need to be based on real victories of the world's edges, but it could be claimed by overpowering those who did. We see this most distinctly in the Adulis stele of Ptolemy III, in which he claims conquest of lands east of the Euphrates as far as Bactria. Now, the Ptolemies never went to Central Asia, but their victory over the Seleucids in the Third Syrian War, as well as later in the Battle of Raphia, could be used to claim conquest over the whole of Asia, thus declaring universal rule. The fact that Polybius tells us this story might even point to another appropriation of victory. Polybius was a Greek author of the 2nd century BC, who himself witnessed the rise of Rome, and the leitmotif in his history is that the world became connected and united under the power of Rome. So his story of Antiochus conquering Central Asia therefore served a narrative of Rome's domination of the known world, because they achieved victory over the Seleucids in 190 BC, and therefore they could indirectly also claim victory over the whole continent of Asia. Now, a fourth case study is Euthydemus of Bactria, a Central Asian king, and in Polybius' narrative, we've seen this citation before, we've seen this passage before. Euthydemus seems to share the same geographical imagination with the Seleucids, despite himself being a Central Asian king. Euthydemus seems to be aware of this globalized memory of the nomadic threat, and he seems to play it into his own hands, so he can negotiate acknowledgement of his own kingship over Bactria. We see this also in an inscription found in Kulop, Tajikistan, where Euthydemus is mentioned to have been given libations and sacrifices, and where he is praised not only as great, but as greatest of all. So this is possibly a reference to his newly acknowledged kingship by Antiochus III, as well as an adaptation of Seleucid greatness that actually surpassed it. So he was not only great, but he was the greatest of all. Now, this newly won greatness of Euthydemus is perhaps reflected in a huge, enormous building program at in Afghanistan. Shortly after 200 BC, after this treaty with Antiochus III, a grand palace complex was built by Euthydemus, which reflects the prestige that came with the greatness. Interestingly so, the north of the city, in the corner, was not built and was kept suspiciously empty, and may well be that the space accommodated tents or temporary dwellings of mobile pastoralists. Unfortunately, this part of the city has not been excavated, and the site has not been researched properly since 1979. But that mobile pastoralists were not completely held at bay, and that there was no strict fault line between nomads and sedentary people is also reflected in a tax receipt from Bactria. This tax receipt, written in Greek, refers to the payment of Scythians as mercenaries. Nevertheless, the discourse of protecting civilization from nomads, this discourse granted the Bactrian rulers trans-imperial recognition and legitimization of their own Central Asian kingdom. Another reference to nomadic lifestyles, and this might be a stretch, is possibly hinted at on the coins of Eucratides. This was a later Bactrian king who explicitly boasted the title the Great on his coinage. And the iconography of the reverse image shows two people on horseback. Now, this image is often associated with the Dioscuri twins, Cas and Pollux, but it's actually quite doubtful whether the iconography retained the same Greek meaning in a Central Asian context. The figure of mounted warriors might actually have spoken more to the Central Asian population, particularly that of mobile pastoralists. And it may well be the case that Eucratides presented himself as a mounted warrior. Good. Then I come to my fifth case study, my last case study. This is Mithridates I of Parthia, a Central Asian king whose dynasty arose from emerged from the Eurasian steppes. It is well known that the Parthian kings, the Arsacid kings, enjoyed quite bad press from Roman authors. We see here two passages, one from Justin and one from Strabo, who describe Arsacus, the founder of the dynasty, as a Scythian, or Scythian in nature. They describe that he lived a life of robbery, a life of banditry, which was barbarian in character, but they also say that his Scythian character did make him successful in war, or actually the whole dynasty, so successful that the Arsacids actually became rivals of the Romans. So we see here a common stereotype of the mounted, belligerent nomad that was projected on the Arsacids to portray them as the hostile other of the Romans. But in terms of globalizing memories, Parthia's fifth king, Mithridates I, is particularly interesting. He was a great conqueror king who transformed the Parthian kingdom into an empire that stretched from Bactria to Babylonia. And on his coinage that we see here, we see a portrait of a king, depicted here with a nomadic cap, the pointed hat. This is something that we also see on the first Arsacid coins. And on the reverse, we see the standard image of a Central Asian archer seated on a chair. Here you see the bow, but also significantly so the image of the archer that you see here is now adapted to imitate or echo, perhaps adapt, the Seleucid image of Apollo that was seated on the Omphalos stone, which was considered as the navel of the earth, the center of the earth. So you see here quite an innovative adaptation. Mithridates I, we know of him that he defeated the Bactrians as well as the Saka, and after his Central Asian conquest, we see that the title Megas, the Great, starts to appear on his coinage. Now, Eucratides of Bactria also claimed greatness around that same time, or shortly before that time, after achieving grand victories in Bactria, Sogdiana, Arya, and if we may believe Strabo, all up to the Terran Basin around 150 BC. Both Mithridates and Eucratides were remembered in literary narratives as great men, and both of them also boast this epithet, the Great, on their coinage. So what we see here is kind of a visual engagement by the Arsacids, engagement with the dynamic discourse around Central Asian conquest. Now this in turn became then connected to expressions of universal kingship and in Mithridates' own context related to the transformation of a kingdom to a world empire, but strangely enough, this world empire was not in Parthia anymore, but was centered on Mesopotamia. Now, what do these case studies tell us? Throughout the second half of the first millennium BC, the space of Central Asia seems to have been entangled with the figure of the Scythian nomad. Now, this space was anchored in transcultural geographical memory as a northeastern frontier zone at the end of the world, where civilization blurred into barbarism. The Central Asian nomad therefore evoked associations with the distant, with the dangerous, with the rebellious, as we have seen under Cyrus the Great, as well as with the barbarous, as we've seen on Greek face paintings, as well as under Alexander, but also with the invincible. The association with the invincible combined with the distant geography of Central Asia as nomadic land further added to its affordance for claiming kingship over the world, universal kingship. Now, in all 5 cases, the title of the great is in some way connected to achievements that were obtained in Central Asia. And in this respect, it's perhaps remarkable that Euthydemus and Mithridates, who were Central Asian kings, also seem to capitalize on this discourse despite that they operated in the Central Asian frontier zone. This discourse enabled them not necessarily to protect their land from barbarism, but it rather provided cultural means to gain power and peer imperial recognition on a global stage. This is not to say that violent interactions with global pastoralists did not occur at all, but I want to emphasize that it's the cultural memory of nomads could create impact on ideological presentations. Now some concluding remarks. What I hope to have shown in the last slides is that we are dealing with transcultural narratives of claimed conquests at the edge of the world. And these narratives of conquest of the edge of the world played a significant role in driving geopolitical connectivity because competing empires, they needed to conquer land to obtain glory and legitimacy. These narratives of geographical imaginations of nomads as well as of their lands, we can say that they globalized through networked trans-imperial interactions between kings of different dynasties who all aim to bring these distant nomadic spaces into the imperial fold, or at least claim that they did so through victories over others. The globalization or the transmission of this memory of the Central Asian nomads was, however, not linear, but it involved contextual adaptations of trans-imperial ideology to serve the concept of universal kingship for different empires. So while recent scholarship has shown the diversity and plurality of Central Asian nomadism, what I've hoped to show here is that a culture approach shows that the memory of the Central Asian nomad actually created a different kind of impact on interconnected microdynamics in Eurasian history. And with that, I conclude my talk. Thank you all for your attention, and thank you so much for your patience with my digital lecture instead of being there in person. I apologize again, but thank you very much for your attention.
Hi Melinda, thank you so much. That was such a great paper. I'm so fascinated, I think as many of us are, by the ways that landscape, like life way and geography get kind of embodied in the figure of the nomad. And as we were talking, I was thinking about this parallel example for classical and medieval Europe, which is like the Ethiop, and like the ways that ideas about difference and distance get embodied in the figure of the Ethiopian. The question I have is like related to the fact that for a long time, like what Europeans thought about the Ethiopian had no impact on Ethiopians, like what John Mandeville or Marco Polo thought said about people in Africa. So until like the 15th and 16th century, when all of a sudden like those ideas like really mattered and shaped those impacts. And like looking at, as you say, like this long-term tension in the first millennium BC between real, as you say, real and fictive or literary representations of these conflicts and impacts and encounters. Do you have a sense of like what is the modality in which like those get brought to bear in like become like impactful like on these nomadic peoples? I mean, again, like there could be myriad ways, but like a couple of examples would be so fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. So if I understand correctly, you're asking about the impact of these narratives on nomads themselves.
Yes.
So
yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. I think the impact can be seen in these wider interconnections that come with empires. So when empires expand, they try to bring these peoples on the imperial frontier, they try to bring them into the fold. And what we see, especially on the Seleucids, but of course also on the Bactrians, we see that these Central Asian peoples, and of course I don't necessarily want to make a strict distinction between who had a nomadic lifestyle and who didn't, but the Central Asian peoples, they are known to be recruited as mercenaries. We don't hear that much about horses in connection to the previous paper, but we hear about elephants. Elephants from Central Asia, from Bactria, as well as from India, or coming via India. So we see, in that sense, we see this wider interconnection of bringing these peripheral or regions that were considered as peripheral to bring these into the fold and to increase those interactions. But what I hope to show is that these this also had the same impact on Central Asia itself, because two of the case studies were Central Asian rulers. So Euthydemus of Bactria, he was Central Asian. And what we see is that there had to be a lot of interaction in the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. And we see that they also take over the same ideological narrative of that nomadic threat. I'm not sure if this really...
that helped like bring that into focus for me. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Hi Milinda again. Thank you very much for this great paper, and lovely to see you at least virtually. I was just wondering about the concept of Central Asia that you used the whole time. I mean, the more I work a little bit in your footsteps on Central Asia, it seems to be a very heterogeneous zone. So there's Sogdiana and Fergana, which from the 3rd century do something very independent. Then there's Bactria, which I think is this sort of Central Asia for the Greeks and Romans. And then there's Gandhara, which is sort of India anyway. And so I wonder, why do you decide to talk about Central Asia as a sort of unit? And secondly, whether one sees the differences of this rather heterogeneous zone in Greco-Roman perceptions of it.
Thank you. That's a really great question. So my use of Central Asia, that I also am very aware in this topic. I had to specify it, that I talk about Southern Central Asia. But the definition that I use for Central Asia is mainly based on Hellenistic Central Asia. So it's I base it on the satrapies of the Achaemenid Empire, which then evolved into the upper satrapies in the Seleucid Empire. These are the regions that I consider as Central Asia, that I define my definition of Central Asia on. But I agree with you, it's quite heterogeneous. In the sense of Gandhara, for instance, is more seen as India, it's more part of India rather than Central Asia. So there are actually several definitions of Central Asia that indeed overlap, also in this presentation. That's a very good observation. Because I use, on the one hand, I use this definition of these satrapies in the Achaemenid and Seleucid Empire, but I also use the definitions that are used in the Hellenistic Central Asian network, which is quite a broad definition, also focused on the south. But in my own work, I tend to work with a general direction of the northeast. So I think this idea of the northeast, the general region or the general direction of this area between the distant edge of the world in the north, in Scythia, and the distant edge of the world in the east, in India, that this actually played a very generic role in the sense of direction where these countries were positioned. And what I had hoped to show is that these, in ancient times, that they didn't know themselves how to pinpoint those. And we see that in, for instance, what I hope at least, is that how Cyrus is possibly influenced by the Assyrian discourse, that also talk about the nomads of sort of general northeastern direction, but this northeast is not located in Central Asia, but is located in the Caucasus. And so later on, we see actually that this idea of the northeast kind of shifts with kind of increasing interconnectivity, shifts towards Central Asia, and this is kind of how I try to justify my use of Central Asia as a region.
Thank you.
I'm going to take 2 minutes in the beginning of this talk to introduce my research team. And that's because much of my work is actually on the archaeology of historical and prehistorical periods in Central Asia, which is the theme for this conference, but it is not what I will be talking about. So, I run this research team in Jena, Germany, and currently it's about 12 postdocs big. It is all funded off of external grant money, and we recently had to pull together a listing of our projects for our funders. We have more than 100 archaeological sites and modern ecological settings that we have assemblages from. So every data point on here is not an individual item from an archaeological site or individual artifact. It's an entire assemblage. That assemblage can be archaeobotanical, it can be zooarchaeological, it can be wood charcoal, or it can be pollen data. We work with a wide variety of different methods. So my area is archaeobotany, that is the core of our projects, but we also have people doing paleoproteomics, paleontology, wood charcoal analyses, zooms, so archaeology through mass spectrometry, and so on. And we've run a series of conferences on these topics. I did notice that Will is hiding right behind my head in that picture. But I have a split personality in academia, so while a large amount of our work is on the archaeology of Central Eurasia, and that is the topic of my first book, Fruit from the Sands, I will be talking today on new theories in domestication, which is the topic of my forthcoming book, which I have been assured by the publishers I can hold within the next 3 to 4 months. It's almost 3 years behind schedule. So, Domesticating Earth. The talk is going to be broken down into 2 parts. The first is actually a bit of a history lesson of domestication theory. I think a lot of this is going to go back to your Intro to Archaeology 101 course, but I take a very different spin on the progression of domestication theory. The second half will present 3 novel ideas or growing ideas in popularity on what early domestication actually looked like and how it played out. So before I move forward, think in your heads what the origins of agriculture looked like and what the political or social ramifications of the origins of agriculture were in various parts of the world. Now, most people fall into one of 2 camps. I'll come back to that in a second. I did want to show the red star up here first. The red star is 2009. Dorian Fuller, one of the lead experts on the origins of agriculture debates, declared that there is a paradigm shift that took hold in 2009, and that paradigm shift is what I will be talking about here. So, there are 2 theories. The first one, 2 camps, I guess. The first one is the greatest of the Faustian bargains. This group of scholars, and I do have biblical images up here because a lot of the writing does sound quite biblical. This group of scholars sees the origins of agriculture as the beginning of the downfall of humanity. It leads to the state, it leads to oppression, it leads to conflict. This is an extremely popular view today. You'll get this in James Scott's Against the Grain. You'll get it in Graeber and Wengrow's highly sensationalized recent book on the dawn of everything. The counter view to this is the greatest innovation of humanity. This was the turning point for humanity. This is the view that V. Gordon Childe popularized in his own words, cultural progress from this point forward. It is also the view you will get in every museum display on the origins of agriculture, on the Neolithic, that was made before the 1990s. So these are all photos I've taken from museums around the world. The center one in there is Cahokia in St. Louis. Both of these views lead into the great why question. So why did humans domesticate plants and animals? Why did humans invent agriculture? And there's 100 years of scholars in archaeology answering the great why question. They break into two camps, the push hypotheses, and we're all familiar with these. It was either climate change, or it was population pressure, or the pull hypotheses, that they had the leisure to innovate social institutions such as wealth accumulation are usually called on here. The 2009 paradigm shift is a point where most domestication scholars or most origins of agricultural scholars have rejected all of this. So everything that I learned in Archaeology 101, and probably all of you learned in Archaeology 101, has been thrown out in favor of unconscious, unintentional, long, protracted processes of slow cultural development of what we call farming and gradual evolutionary changes towards domestication. Within this, I guess in the beginning, we get rid of that. All of the first discussions of the origins of agriculture that relied on kind of secular views come with the Enlightenment. So everybody's familiar with the Hobbesian hawks and the Rousseauian doves. It has been heavily discussed in archaeological theory how these two scholars influenced the trajectory of thought in archaeology. If you're not familiar, Hobbes is the first to theorize what a pre-agricultural population would have looked like. He's often quoted for using the word brutish. But he theorizes that they would have had short life expectancies and there would have been large amounts of intergroup violence. Rousseau is the ultimate contrarian. He, 100 years later, re-theorizes what the origins of agriculture looks like. He sets off the counter-Enlightenment movement, and he suggests that pre-agricultural people lived in a state of peace and harmony. There was no intergroup violence. They had all the food they could possibly want. And it was essentially a state of being at one with nature. He invents the noble savage argument, and this Rousseauian dove narrative is resurrected over and over again throughout domestication theory. Comte de Buffon is the first one to take a scientific approach to the origins of agriculture debates. He is a humanist, so of course he sees this as an active, intelligent process. Humans are inventing domesticated plants and animals. He's also an atheist, so the N up there in nature is, or the capital N is original, so he's buying into some form of the god of Spinoza or the nature god of Goethe. It is, Alexander von Humboldt is the first to kind of travel the world to find the origins of agriculture, along with a whole lot of other research questions that he embraced. He leaves from the small town of Jena, Germany, which incidentally is where I left from 2 days ago to get here. Alphonse de Candolle is the first to pull this together into a coherent narrative. Charles Darwin popularizes the origins of agriculture debate for the first time. Ernst Haeckel, also in Jena, Germany, is in close lockstep his entire career with Charles Darwin. Darwin writes The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication, the foundational book on the origins of agriculture debates and on the topic of what domestication is. And Ernst Haeckel, not to be shown up, basically creates the foundations of the field of anthropology in the book Anthropology. Now, what's important here is if you look at the writings of Haeckel and Darwin, they saw the earliest processes as unintentional, unconscious. They saw it as slow and protracted. For Darwin, all evolution is slow and protracted. They didn't have a concept of centers of domestication. The writing before Pavlov and They see it as extensions to evolution in the wild. They use domestication as their greatest case study to try to convince the masses that evolution did occur. And that means the 2009 paradigm shift is a point in time where the field took 150 years to circle back around to the ideas that Darwin and his contemporaries took for granted. Now, in all fairness, these ideas actually never went anywhere. You can very much find them in the Soviet Union with Nikolai Ivanovich Pavlov. You could find them in the dual publications in North America with Edgar Anderson and Carl Sauer. And I needed to put at least one of the architects of the modern synthesis up here, so C.D. Darlington, and most importantly of all, the writings of David Rindos. The 2009 paradigm shift is a resurrection of ideas that already existed and were already used. The catch is they were heavily ostracized and pushed to the boundaries of the field, especially by archaeologists. David Rindos himself is run out of the field of archaeology. He dies at 49 years old, alone in his kitchen, unemployed, broke, and since his death, the ideas that he lays out in that influential book are repeatedly reinvented without him being cited. So why is it that this happened in archaeology? Why is it that this 2009 moment in time, despite the fact that these approaches have existed all along, took hold? So, back in 1902, with the geographer from upstate New York, this is Raphael Pumpelly, and I think most of the people in the room are familiar with him. He went to southern Central Asia, excavated an archaeological site called Anau. He wrote a 2-volume tome on that expedition. And very shortly, in a page and a half in there, he theorizes why it is that humans would have chosen to leave the life of leisure in this kind of Garden of Eden-esque state for the life of toil and struggle under the plow. He theorizes that the only reason they would have done that is if they were forced to. So he says it's desertification of southern Central Asia, people forced onto ever smaller river valleys or oases, forced to innovate, forced to create farming and create domesticated plants and animals in order to survive. Now, of course, we all know that V. Gordon Childe picks this up 3 decades later and promotes it as the oasis or propinquity model. It's not the model itself that matters here, it is the way the question becomes reframed at this point. It becomes, why did humans do this? Why did humans domesticate plants and animals? Why did humans invent farming? 3 decades further ahead, in Chicago, amidst the race riots in 1967, a team of cultural anthropologists come together, and they're very clear on their motives and goals. They are trying to empower the voices of non-agricultural populations. The loudest voice to come out of this conference is Marshall Salins, who publishes Stone Age Economics. This is where the original affluent society comes out of. He says, pre-agricultural populations live in a state of peace and harmony. He's not pulling punches in what he is framing here. It's very clearly laid out. He says that they're living in a state of leisure. They do not have to work hard to feed their populations, and they're essentially at a state of peace with nature. It is very much a resurrection of the Rousseauian dove. Many scholars have ripped apart his data sets. They're heavily not fabricated, but exaggerated. We'll use the word exaggerated. Nonetheless, it goes viral in archaeology. This is where you get scholars such as Cohen with Food Crisis and Prehistory. This will ultimately lead into what becomes Graeber and Wengrow. It'll also spawn the post-processual movement for the topic of the origins of agriculture. And I'm not going to sit up here and critique the critique of post-processualism. I will cite one of, if not the most important philosophers of the modern era, who lays out the critique for all of the social sciences, pointing out specifically there is an adverse response to evolutionary discussions, there's an adverse response to statistical approaches, and to grand narratives. For the origins of agriculture debates, this has already actually been laid out. Christian Grimillion and her colleagues wonderfully depict all of these points in 2014. So really what this 2009 paradigm shift is a point in time where we can use large data sets, we can use statistical approaches, and we can talk about evolutionary ideas again. So all of these figures up here come from publications that my team either has recently put out or has in press. Every point on there is an entire archaeobotanical assemblage of individual measurements. Some of them are tens of thousands of length and width measurements on individual grains. These are all for barley. They cover 10,000 years, and they allow us to talk about responses in these plants to environmental variables, to cultural variables, and most importantly of all, they allow us to temporally measure out size change under domestication. So the only real variable here that you need to look at is this little jump right there. That is the actual domestication of barley laid out. That is a size change in the individual grains. And what's important here is it took 2,000 to 3,000 years. No human purview stretches that far ahead in time. If we think of our politicians, they can't think beyond 1 year. So there's no way to argue that these processes that took 200 human generations could have played out in an intentional, conscious way. Additionally, if we look at all of the centers of agriculture around the world, all of the places that plants evolved domestication traits for the first time, they happen in arid regions, in high mountains, in tropical zones, in different cultural settings and under different human population densities. Any kind of comparative archaeological approach would break down one overarching argument for the entire system. And in my opinion, the most important argument here, the one that puts the nail in the coffin, is actually coming from historians. And they've been kind of removed from this debate for a long time. And that's on both sides here. They have not engaged in the origins of agriculture debate as much, or the origins of domesticated plants and animals debates, and archaeologists have not consulted them. This is a small subsection of the agronomy manuals from the ancient world. I am not a historian. I work with a lot of historians. I'm very happy to be proven wrong on any of these points, but I've asked a lot of my colleagues and nobody has been able to challenge me on it. No historical text before the Enlightenment presents something that looks like conscious directed breeding. They don't have a concept of heredity. So there's lots and lots of concepts of heredity in pre-Enlightenment text, but a concept of heredity that would have allowed directed breeding to work. And they don't have a concept of a species changing over time or being able to change that species over time in a way that would have allowed directed breeding to work. Some caveats here. One is, especially the classical writers, Pliny being the most prominent of these, love grafting of plants onto other plants, and they love hybridization of unrelated animals. So Pliny is really obsessed with creating chimeric beings. And he says at some time in the distant past it was still possible to do this, but every one of these chimeric beings that he talks about are biologically impossible. And he recognizes that and notes that he was unsuccessful in creating any of them himself, so that at some time in the distant past it was possible, but in his lifetime it is no longer possible. This magic or this power is gone. There's also a lot of recognition of varieties in here, but there is no recognition of being able to change varieties over time. So again, all of these views in the last decade or so have been largely brushed aside by scholars, leaving a way for unconscious arguments. And these have also been around for a while. I think most of you are already familiar with these. Things like the sickle harvesting hypothesis. And again, these are all photos I've taken in museums around the world. The sickle harvesting hypothesis is the centerpiece of almost all European museums with discussions of the Neolithic. You know the argument that harvesting with stone-set sickle blades leads to the evolution of tough rakuses. Nobody recognizes in these discussions that in the last few years there have been a series of publications that have argued against this. The Maida et al. Publication coming out of Dorian Fuller's lab is probably the most conclusive on this topic, noting that sickle blades do not become prominent in any Neolithic site in Southwest Asia until after the evolution of tough rapaces in cereal crops. Most likely, early harvesting of the early farmers was done in the same way we ethnographically know it was done in other parts of the world, either through basket swinging or beating grains into the basket. These methods only stopped working after the evolution of tough rapaces. This suggests that the entire argument is upside down. Sickle blades were invented as a response to the evolution of domestication traits that humans were unaware of in one lifetime and had no actual control over mitigating. Burial depth hypothesis also heavily attacked. Essentially the argument is the deeper you bury a seed, the more it will evolve to be larger. Several publications, a prominent one coming out of Glynis Jones's lab in Sheffield, simply doing experimental stuff here, showing that it would have to be buried over a foot deep in the ground, and stone set hoes simply don't dig down that deep. The argument really starts to fall apart. And this leaves us at a really exciting time in origins of agriculture debates and in domestication debates, because there's this huge gap. So the field has gone and thrown out all of its core ideas, or at least attacked all of its core ideas, but almost nobody's putting new ones out there. So, with the time I have left, I will present 3 new ideas. And these are not all exactly from me, but they're all ones that I've been pushing over the last few years. Seed dispersal constraints hypothesis. This is actually really simple, and I'm going to personify the plant here. This is a big no-no in the ecology literature, but it makes it a lot easier to talk about these things. So the parent plant wants to invest as much energy as possible into its offspring. The seed with the greatest seed provisioning has the best chance to outcompete other plants and spread its own seeds. The catch to this is the parent plant wants even more to move its seeds away from itself. If there's an annual and it drops all seeds directly below itself, it will lose an entire generation due to sibling competition. If it is a perennial, such as a tree, and it drops all of its seeds directly below itself, it will lose an entire generation due to parent-offspring competition. Mobility is necessary in plants. Every flowering plant, every angiosperm in the world has evolved a way to move. They're not always easy to parse out, but there is always a mobility way. Arguably, if we can figure out what the pre-domestication, what the progenitor seed dispersal system was for quinoa, we should understand why the quinoa that we put on your salad today is as small as it is. Humans can disperse a seed of any size. So once humans start moving these, once they plant seeds, once they actually exchange seeds, move them from one farming community to another farming community, the seed dispersal constraints have been moved. The plant, hypothetically, should start evolving seeds that are much larger. It just essentially putting more energy into its offspring. Hypothetically, what would a seed look like if for thousands or millions of years all of these seed dispersal constraints were removed from it? We don't need to hypothesize because we know. There are dozens of examples of gigantism in seeds. They're all ocean dispersed. All the largest seeds in the world are ocean dispersed. Ocean dispersed seeds are almost all large. Ericaceae and Fabaceae on the screen here. This is monocots and dicots. This evolves repeatedly over and over again in ocean dispersed seeds across the angiosperms. Essentially, the ocean can disperse something the size of an ocean liner, so there's no constraints on seed size. The same logic should apply for humans, that once they start moving these seeds, they should just naturally start to increase in size. This opens a whole series of interesting questions about what the progenitor mechanisms were for these plants before humans step into the picture. We know very clearly what's going on for all the mechanical dispersed plants. So this is the large seeded legumes and the large seeded grasses. They all evolve early on to lose their mechanical dispersal mechanisms. For the large fruited plants as well, when you think of your produce stands, apples being one of them, we know that the progenitor population for the apple today is restricted to a small region in southeastern Kazakhstan. So if we can argue why something like this, or possibly more like this, became that progenitor for the modern apple, which is about halfway between the size of a golf ball and a tennis ball, then it should be very easy to explain what the last minor steps were once humans stepped into this picture. We can get at these questions through the paleontological record, and paleontologists discuss this extensively, why plants would evolve very large fruits, and we could do it through modern ecological settings. It is almost certainly a response to megafaunal animals, especially megafaunal animals with single-chambered stomachs, these monogastric animals. These plants are evolving for larger dispersers. And we can test these hypotheses with ecological studies. The catch is, for something like the apple in the northern hemisphere, at the end of the Pleistocene, the megafaunal animals disproportionately went extinct, or the monogastric ones disproportionately went extinct in relation to the ruminants or the ungulate grazing animals. So there's not a lot of examples we can work with other than the bears. So my team has a wonderful ongoing project in upstate New York where one of these guys has recolonized an abandoned apple orchard, and I can assure you they're phenomenal dispersers of apple seeds. But this is really exciting because we can look at the genetics, we can look at the paleontological record, we can look at the archaeological record, and we can piece together a whole narrative here. So on the map in the background, these are all finds, archaeological finds of apple seeds from archaeological sites, with the exception of Kazakhstan over there. They're all from the mid-Holocene or earlier. And this allows us to pull together this narrative of a hybridization process, that the modern apple is a hybrid of 4 different wild apple species, the Tian Shan wild apple being the key one. And that means as humans moved these apples across the trans-Eurasian exchange routes, which we can colloquially refer to as the Silk Road, they hybridized, leading to the modern apple. So this is actually domestication via the Silk Road or via the trans-Eurasian exchange routes. It is not just the apple, it is most of the large fruited produce in your produce market today. So a wonderful study by my colleague Logan Kistler at the Smithsonian Institute, studying the genetics of wild cucurbits in North America, noting that in the early Holocene they have population loss or range loss, population fragmentation, and increased inbreeding. The domestication of the North American cucurbits was simply a moving of these fruits by humans between these isolated populations. The populations were isolated because the North American monogastric megafaunal animals went extinct. So the earliest iterations of these ideas trace back to the ecologist Daniel Jansen in 1982. And this leads us to the other group of progenitors. We'll call them the small-seeded annuals, so the millets, buckwheat, quinoa, amaranth, and the like. So what is their dispersal mechanism? The argument, again, is if we can figure out what their wild dispersal mechanism is, we can piece together the domestication process. Daniel Jansen, 1984, again, he theorizes megafaunal animals, but these are the ruminant grazing animals. This is what he calls the foliage as fruit hypothesis, that these are plants evolved to be consumed by ruminant grazing animals. And we know that heavy ruminant grazing removes certain plants from the landscape, but it concentrates other plants on the landscape. And this is key to the domestication process because almost all of those progenitors are thinly dispersed on their landscapes today, or in many cases are actually extinct. So there had to be a different mechanism at play for humans to go in and start foraging those seeds. They needed dense wild populations to make them a viable target. The ruminant grazing animals create dense wild stands that early seed foragers could have utilized. Additionally, the three traits of domestication in all of these are thinning of the seed coat, a breaking of dormancy, and an increase in seed size. These are actually the three traits that allow the foliage as fruit model to work. They need a thick seed coat, they need the dormancy because they don't want to wake up halfway through the digestive system, and they need small seed because a restrictive caecum of an ungulate digesting animal holds back all plant material larger than 2 millimeters for secondary digestion and fermentation. So the domestication process, again, is a switching off of the wild seed dispersal mechanism. In this case, it is also an animal dispersal, what we call endozoocharic dispersal. I was going to plug early collaborations in graduate school here, but Michael beat me to them. So the 2013 publication is the earliest iteration for me of some of these ideas at Washington University. That paper was written with Michael when I was a grad student. And interestingly, it sticks with the Washington in St. Louis, the St. Louis theme. Natalie Mueller pulling together some of these ideas with me back in 2019, discussing three-way mutualisms with megafaunal animals, humans, and the progenitors for the domesticated crops. It is kind of a new way of thinking about the origins of domesticated plants. I think the most interesting of these is the North American lost crops, a project that Natalie Mueller is spearheading, looking at what happens when you reintroduce bison to tall grass prairies in North America. The preliminary results already show that bison concentrate the progenitors for the North American lost crops along bison runs and bison wallows. It means the bison are the lost variable in understanding the domestication of the North American lost crops. The pleiotropy hypothesis, or what we could also call, or what I think we should probably call, the allometric linkage or scaling hypothesis, it's also very simple. And I think it was best illustrated by graduate students in Glynis Jones and Colin Osborne's lab in Sheffield in 2017. All he did was measure seed size change in vegetatively propagated plants and plants that are cultivated for their vegetative structures. Plants that nobody would be selecting larger seeds for. And he shows that they increase in seed size under domestication at the same rates and to the same magnitude as grain crops. Therefore, the selective mechanisms have to be on the plant itself, not on the seed. And I think we get lost with this in archaeobotany, or I know I have. We are so focused on the seed, we don't think about the larger organism. That means seed sizes increase under domestication in response to plant mass increases. And I've taken this argument one step further for the mechanical dispersed plants again. Now we're back to that brittle rachis versus tough rachis argument. These mechanical dispersal mechanisms stop working when a seed evolves to be a certain size. The tough rachis evolution under domestication was likely not a response to that sickle harvesting. It was likely a response to those plants evolving to be larger in those early agricultural fields. The sickles were developed later on in response to this trait being locked in place. So, I wish I could take credit for this idea, and I will read this one quote. But most of my ideas on early domestication come from very obscure evolutionary ecology literature from decades past. This is Carl Quist, 1964. He states that pleiotropic genes might have such an effect. Changes which lead to gigantism throughout the plant body might effectively cancel a dispersal mechanism which depends on small fruits or small seeds. So the larger the seed gets, the more these dispersal mechanisms stop working. The seeds are getting larger because the plants are getting larger. So the real question is, why are the plants getting larger? What's interesting here is Carl Quist is an island biogeographer. He's never discussed anything to do with domestication in his entire career. Why is he, back in 1964, pulling together what is possibly the missing variable for what domestication was in prehistory? And this leads us into the insularity or ecological release hypothesis. In order to introduce this last hypothesis, I'm going to give you another quick history lesson on science. And for many of you, this is going to be a repeat to things you already know, but just bear with me. So we all know that Alfred Russel Wallace and Darwin invent or develop the concept of natural selection through studies of island populations. So Darwin is particularly interested in the Galapagos finches and the Galapagos tortoises. Wallace is particularly interested in birds and butterflies in the South Pacific. Darwin is especially interested in something that he will call island tameness. He's fascinated by the fact that he can walk up to a bird perched on a branch and catch it in his hand. He also talks extensively about the Falkland Island foxes. So when the eagle lands in the Falkland Islands, these foxes run up to the sailors inquisitively. The sailors then proceed to beat them over the head and eat them. And Darwin theorizes that the Falkland Island fox would soon be extinct. And it was indeed. In fact, one of the only specimens that still existed today is in a museum and was collected by Darwin. But it's the dog-like features that he emphasizes in his writing. Ernst Mayr, one of the most important architects of the modern synthesis, develops all his ideas of domestication by studying island populations. He develops the concept of a founder effect. Foster is the first one to pull together all of the data on size change in animals on oceanic islands. And everybody knows this. Large animals shrink in size, small animals increase in size. We all call this the island rule. The proper name is actually the Foster rule. All of this pulled together in one coherent narrative for the first time with fancy graphs and mathematical equations that all go way over my head by Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson. What's really important in this book is in the introduction, they discuss deforestation in Cadiz County, Wisconsin. So why would E.O. Wilson, one of the most important evolutionary ecologists of all times, talking about island biogeography, have an entire introduction on Wisconsin? It's because he recognized that what we call habitat islands on the mainland, you can think of an oasis in the middle of a desert or a habitat on the top of a mountain, these function ecologically just like oceanic islands. He also recognized that everything humans do fragments landscapes. When humans build a city, when they build a highway, when they dam up rivers, they are fragmenting landscapes, and most importantly, when they deforest landscapes and leave small little patches of forest, the plants and animals trapped in those small little patches of forest are experiencing the same insularity pressures as oceanic islands. It was 2 decades before anybody in the conservation and ecology work recognized the significance of this observation. And actually, interestingly, for all of us archaeologists in the room, the individual who first recognized the significance of this is a name you're all familiar with. It's Jared Diamond. Before he was writing about guns, germs, and steel, before he wrote Collapse, he was actually a really amazing island biogeographer and conservation biologist. This concept of anthropogenic landscapes being fragmented archipelagos of islands, this becomes the foundational principle for park and nature preserve conservation systems today. So what does an insular population of animals on an oceanic island look like? How do they evolve? They lose secondary sexual display organs. They have coat color changes. Often they become white or piebald in color. They have endocrine system changes. They lose their fight or flight responses. They have reproductive system changes. Often they reproduce much faster. Essentially, every trait in the island syndrome for animals is paralleled in the domestication syndrome for animals. And this is a logical conclusion if you really think about it, because while none of these scholars have pointed this out, an ancient village in prehistory would have functioned for the organisms trapped in it, the plants and animals trapped within it, it would have functioned as a habitat island. So over thousands of years, you would expect the insular animals and plants in that population to evolve in the same way that we see predictable patterns in oceanic islands. Now, this is still a hypothesis. However, it works really well for animals. The question is, does it work for plants? Is there island syndrome in plants? Back in the 1960s, Carl Quist argued, yes, there is an island syndrome for small seeded annual plants. When they become trapped on an island for a long enough period of time, they evolve to have larger seeds. They increase overall plant mass and they lose their seed dispersal mechanisms. These are the exact 3 traits of domestication in all of our agricultural crops. So as discussed back in the 1960s, does it hold up to the test of time? 2019, just before the pandemic, Kevin Burns revisits the topic of an island syndrome for plants and argues, yes, it does still hold up and provides a large number of additional case studies. I'll look at 2 quick case studies here. The image in the background is Berkeley Sound in the northwest coast of North America. Cody, another island biogeographer, was studying 2 small, weedy, invasive species on the islands in this sound. They're both in their basal state, wind dispersed. So they have these little pampas structures like a dandelion seed. In the mainland, on the background, these 2 species, which have only been here for roughly 100 years, they are invasive species. In the background, on the mainland, they all have these wind dispersal structures. When they blow across the sound into this archipelago of very small islands, they land on these small islands and relatively rapidly they start to evolve to lose their dispersal mechanisms and increase in seed size. This is 2 unrelated species doing this on all these different islands. The other variable that's really important here is the seeds are not viable after being in salt water. So they can't evolve this trait on one island and then float to another island. They're evolving the same pathway towards something that looks like domestication independently on every island in the Berkeley Sound, and it's not one species, it's 2 completely different species doing the same thing. It's maybe one of the greatest case studies for understanding what domestication actually looked like in prehistory in the ancient world. If you think of each of these small islands functioning like an agricultural village in prehistory with parallel evolution of domestication traits across all of the agricultural crops in these populations. One more case study, Montpellier, France, another team of ecologists starting in 2008. They started studying this weed that is growing in these little medians in the sidewalk, the squares where they plant the trees. I don't know if there's an actual name for those things, but the little squares. They all function like very small islands. It's all concrete on either side or asphalt on the other side. This weed, in its wild state outside the city, is also wind dispersed. It has one of these pampas structures as well. On these small medians, in a relatively short period of time, this team of ecologists has shown that they are evolving to lose their dispersal mechanism and the seeds are evolving to become larger. Now there's 2 arguments as to what is possibly going on here. And I've called them in publication the sea-swept hypothesis and ecological release hypothesis. Sea-swept hypothesis is coming from Darwin. It is his argument for why birds on islands would evolve to lose flight. He says that if they evolve to get better flight, they're more likely to be swept to sea and lost, so they're better off evolving to lose flight completely. This is the argument that the Montpellier, France team uses to talk about the loss of the seed dispersal mechanism. They argue that if these plants maintain their seed dispersal mechanism, most of the seeds will blow into the gutters and be washed into the sewers, so they'll be lost. The other argument is the ecological release argument, is that birds on islands have evolved to lose flight because there's no predators to fly away from. Flight is energetically costly. So if you want to focus your energy on surviving on a small island, you want to lose flight completely. So essentially the loss of predators pushes the evolution of domestication-like traits. And this would obviously work really well for understanding early agriculture, early domestication around the world. Ecological release, the concept in ecology is that if you remove predators, if you remove herbivory on plants, if you put in as much nutrients, as much water into these organisms as they possibly want, they will evolve in very specific ways. that is in theory what is going on when these plants become trapped on oceanic islands, or these animals become trapped on oceanic islands. They lack predation, they lack herbivory, so they put all of their energy into reproduction and remove any traits that they did not need for survival so they can better compete with their own kind on that island. These are not mutually exclusive theories. So, whether you buy into any of this argument or not, the similarities between oceanic island evolution in both plants and animals are too much related to the similarities with domestication that we can't just brush it aside. It has to at least be engaged in, even if in the future we come up with arguments that go against it. Now, one last point before I pass over the floor, but ecological release. Interestingly, this is actually something that follows a pattern that ecologists can follow. So, if we were to test this hypothesis, how would we go about testing it? We can look for natural experiments. So this is the park and nature preserve systems. We can look at the way plants and animals are actually evolving in response to humans fragmenting that landscape. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of ecologist teams around the world actually doing this. The catch is, the longest running of these natural experiments has maybe been going on for 2 centuries. We're talking about processes that were going on for 2,000 to 3,000 years. So short of inventing a time machine, how do we test something like that? You got to speed up the reproductive rates in the organisms. The only way we can do that in evolutionary ecology is microbial studies. The longest running microbial study of evolution was started in University of California, Irvine by Richard Lemsky in the 1980s. It is an E. coli study. He took an individual colony of E. coli, he put it in a beaker, and every day he came into his lab and fed it sugar. And over time he measured the cell diameter changes, the way the plant or the microbe actually started evolving. It rapidly evolved to have larger cells over 2,000 to 3,000 generations. And it plateaued off, or it seemed to plateau off, but it never really plateaued off. This is actually a very well-known pattern in ecology. We call it a power log distribution. And it's very exciting to see because it is the same distribution that you see with ecological release in the wild for things like invasive species in a new area. It, in theory, would be the pattern you would see for oceanic island adaptation as well. But it's just one colony, and the patterns are useless unless you can compare them to something else. Luckily, Richard Lemsky saw ahead and ran 12 different colonies. The evolutionary ecologist David Sloan Wilson has referred to these 12 colonies as functioning like oceanic islands, so it's very well recognized what the variables here are. It is an insularity pressure. The key is there are no pathogens in these little beakers, and these organisms have as much water and as much sugar as they could possibly want. So they're essentially evolving to lose as many features as they do not possibly need. Any kind of defensive features, they're rapidly losing it all and putting everything into reproduction and growth. And that can only go so far, and then they kind of parallel off. So why do we care about that in domestication? This is actually a very simplistic version of those large, massive metadata sets that I showed you earlier on. This is all of the cereal crops in Southwest Asia. If you look at each one of those data sets involving hundreds of thousands of individual length and width measurements, and you kind of smooth them out, you end up with power log distributions. They rapidly increase in size over 2,000 to 3,000 years, and then they seem to level off, but they never completely level off. They just slow down their rate of growth. So, they're still theories, but they are testable theories. These are hopefully the theories that the next generation of domestication scholars will grapple with. They fill in a gap in the field right now. So I will end with an egregious plug again for the book.
So I guess what strikes me about this discussion around the how we think about domestication, or whether it was like some glorious human achievement or all this evolutionary accident. It's interesting to me that there's such a disconnect between the plant and the animal literature on this topic. It seems like if I'm kind of thinking in the meme format of like woke, broke, bespoke, whatever, ultimately the synthesis stuff has to be something that returns to evolutionary context for human behavior and also recognition of human decisions existing. I mean, from the animal perspective, I mean, you could get almost 100% predictive success with just mapping where was there a pre-existing plant, grain domestication, and a friendly animal. And so there, in the animal side, there's inherently some amount of human, at least behavior, if not decisions, involved in like feeding an animal. It has to be like this huge precondition for almost every large animal domestication event, other than, you know, maybe the dog or something like that. And I wonder what you think about why there are these like parallel logic systems. It almost seems like one of the flaws with the way we talk about origins of agriculture is that everything goes back into this kind of like hypothetical video game space where there's a human band interacting with its immediate environment, and most of the things that were domesticated in some way are like a historical contingency related to, I mean, at least with animals, you know, there's a strong relationship to what the other animal and plant relationships were before that, and maybe you can envision a world in which it does make sense to think about these initial origin points slightly differently than the things that come after them a little bit. I guess if that makes sense. And just as an example, you brought up, you know, most of this stuff doesn't interface much with animals, but when it does, I think the fox stuff is beautiful to talk about how, you know, a lot of the phenotype and behavior that we think might be human choice is an accident, but also almost certain that, like, if some, you know, in the past, if a fox or a dog bit somebody on the hand, somebody whacked it with a rock, right? And so, I mean, can we move to a model in which the plant and animal spheres are unified a little bit, and where it's, you know, human choice making is built back in here without being, you know, oppositional in the way that it currently stands?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a whole series of long questions, but...
Yeah, sorry. Mostly I just want to get in an argument with you.
Yeah, I'm happy to argue, and sadly I didn't get to go into any of the fox stuff, but the fox stuff is actually really perfect because you have the evolution of domestication traits happening relatively rapidly in urban foxes across all of Europe right now. Every city in Europe that has dog extermination programs, foxes are evolving traits to basically fill the dog niche, the feral dog niche. They're getting shorter noses, they're becoming less wary of humans. They're even having, there's one study that suggests they're having reproductive response, size changes as well. So the London foxes, this is all happening without humans obviously selecting for any of these changes. They're just responses to foxes filling a niche that was opened up through extermination programs of feral dogs. You see the same exact patterns with ocean island foxes. The Channel Island foxes of Berkeley, the islands in the tip of South America. Same evolutionary responses, and obviously the fur farm foxes. But this is where the issue is. We've got the fur farm foxes where they're actively selecting. So they can do the same process and you end up with the same exact results, whether humans are consciously and actively doing it or not. And that's where we end up in archaeology with this problem. How do we interpret what we're dealing with when you end up with the same results, whether it is directed breeding or whether it is an unconscious process? But that said, I fully 100% agree humans are actively adapting to their environment. They're actively engaging with plants and animals. They're using amazing traditional knowledge systems to farm, to herd animals, only variable that I'm arguing against is whether they were aware that they were evolutionarily changing those animals over time. But I think we're late for lunch.
That's it.
Let's begin arguing on
That's it, I'm too
this over here.
hungry.